Professor Shaw, you ready?
I think I'm ready. Just give me the go and let's go.
Okay. You are our beginning speaker.
All right. So if everybody can hear me, let's get started. Hello. I am Ted Shaw, Theodore M. Shaw, and I am, along with Yolanda Melville, the co-chair of our Civil Rights Summit. This is the third time that we're doing this, the third year. Of course, we're in an extraordinary time, and so we're not able to come together physically, but we're together nonetheless. We welcome all of those who are participating remotely, who are on right now. We have mechanics that we want everybody to be conscious of. There may be some hiccups, and we want you to stay with us and work with us as we go through the next day and a half. It will be worthwhile. I can't help but acknowledge that we are in an extraordinary moment, not only because of the time, the COVID time, because of the time we're in with respect to the politics of the country, but even today, we're bumping up against the funeral of John Lewis. And even before his passing, we had planned to say something about Congressman Lewis because he was ill. And we knew that we weren't going to have him with us that much longer. I'm not going to say everything that's in my heart and on my mind about John Lewis, except to say that those of us who worked in civil rights loved, respected, admired him. He was more than a hero. He was the heartbeat, as I've said, of the civil rights community in this country in many ways. His standard speech in his later years, everybody now knows about good trouble, about necessary trouble. It's an inspiration. And so we start off saying that John Lewis would want us to be doing what we're doing right now, I'm sure. He would have appreciated everybody who gathered in Atlanta for the funeral. I hope people are videotaping it if they can't see it. But he would have wanted the work to continue. And so that's what we're doing. We gather as people who work in the field of labor, the labor movement. We have civil rights advocates. We have people from the faith community. We have lawyers. We have scholars. We have activists. Most importantly, we have young people with us. Barbara Ransby will speak, and she's written about Ella Baker, and Ella Baker believed not only in organizing but in the importance of young people. And so we have these constituencies here gathered virtually together, and our purpose is to re-energize, to continue to energize the struggle for civil rights, for labor rights, for those who believe in racial and economic justice. That's why we're gathering, and to connect with one another, to recommit to the work that we do. So as I said, it's particularly appropriate that we're doing this at the moment that we're saying farewell to John Lewis, who will continue to inspire us And we are very much committed and grateful for everybody who's here and participating. But we also want to come out of this with some action agendas, including an awareness and a focus on not only the time we're in, but the need to push for new legislation, a repassage of the Voting Rights Act, but also housing and education agenda, and of course to commit ourselves to seeing that the change that's necessary to reset the table in our country occurs before this year is out. So it's an honor. I'm not going to get in the way a whole lot. And Yolanda, my co-chair, Yolanda Melville, is a younger person. And I believe it's important to pass the baton. So right this moment, I'm going to pass the baton to Yolanda, and we will begin the program, and she'll take us toward that beginning. Honored to be with you, and I hope that the next day and a half is rewarding and energizing, and that we recommit ourselves to our struggle and our work. Yolanda.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yolanda Melville, as Professor Shaw has mentioned, and I'm honored to serve as the co-chair for the third annual and first virtual Summit for Civil Rights, along my esteemed, legendary civil rights attorney and distinguished professor of law, Ted Shaw, my co-chair. The members of this year's Summit Planning Committee have worked tirelessly to provide you a series of impactful, intergenerational, and timely discussions over the next 2 days. Because we will be taking several extended breaks throughout our program, we are asking each participant and each attendee to pay attention to the links contained in your program. I do want to mention, as Professor Shaw mentioned, today is the burial of Congressman John Lewis. We will have a series of different ways to honor him over the Summit for Civil Rights, but right over my shoulder is his book, Across That Bridge. And I think this summit will provide some insight on how we can cross the next bridge of making informed and impactful decisions over the next 100 years of our civil rights history. So again, I will turn it over. I thank you, Professor Shaw, for allowing me to co-chair with you on the event, and turn it over to our esteemed Dean Garry Jenkins. Dean Jenkins, you have the floor.
Hello, I'm here. I think the co-host is going to have to unmute my video. I don't appear to be able to do that. There we go. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2020 Summit for Civil Rights. As was mentioned, I'm Garry Jenkins. I'm the Dean of the University of Minnesota Law School. And of course, I wish that we could all be together in person, and that I was welcoming you all to Minneapolis and to our campus at the law school. But nonetheless, I am delighted to have this opportunity for us to gather virtually, because the work that we have to do together is just so important, and it cannot wait. As Professor Shaw mentioned, this is the third summit in the last 3 years, and I'm so proud that the summit started here at the University of Minnesota Law School back in 2017, and the law school's Journal of Law and Inequality and our Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity co-hosted that first summit, as they are co-hosting this summit now. And when I reflect back and think about that marvelous set of meetings that we had together in 2017. We had Vice President Walter Mondale, class of 56, Congressman James Clyburn. We had then Congressman and now Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, class of 90, and numerous scholars and lawyers and elected officials and union leaders and activists and community organizers and philanthropists all coming together to discuss the powerful and transformative and hard-won civil rights victories of the past, while also confronting persistent, new, and emerging civil rights strategies and struggles of the present. And we need that kind of thoughtful and important conversations to continue. And we need them now. And we need higher education to partner, to convene scholars and activists, to lay a foundation and a path forward. And when I, like you, I know, think about the past 2 months and what our country has witnessed after the extraordinary outpouring of anger and outrage, but also solidarity following the murder of Minneapolis resident George Floyd right here by a police officer on May 25th. It's really been remarkable, and perhaps it's because of, not in spite of, but actually because of the fact that it came at a time of a global health crisis, at a time of extreme political polarization, at a time where there's massive economic upheaval. I think that we now have more attention, a more common understanding, and a willingness to openly discuss what so many of us on this webinar have known for a long time, and many are now learning, which is that this violence is a symptom of the structural racism of many of our institutions, of our laws, of policies, across a wide range of issues. So at this moment, this kind of major convening of multiracial, intergenerational leaders, including some of the nation's top civil rights leaders and thinkers from labor and faith and academia and law and government. It's so important if we're really serious about making changes and bringing about racial and economic justice. We are so proud that the summit has come back home, so to speak, during this galvanizing moment for Minneapolis, for Minnesota, and for our nation. The University of Minnesota has a really long and proud history of training many of America's civil rights leaders. Roy Wilkins, Clarence Mitchell, Whitney Young, right? Legendary leaders of the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and the National Urban League. They all studied at the University of Minnesota. Hubert Humphrey was the Senate floor leader of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and law school graduate Walter Mondale co-authored the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And now today, another law school grad, Keith Ellison, is a central figure in America's efforts to give meaning to the death of George Floyd and the 2,000 or more civil rights protests that have resulted. My friend and colleague, Professor Myron Orfield, and the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity, which he heads, continues with this tradition in their work on helping develop President Obama's fair housing rules, or their work in supporting the Congressional Black Caucus and developing civil rights legislation, and working with civil rights lawyers and advocates on important fair housing and school diversity cases. So I really just want to say thank you. I want to say welcome. I want to congratulate the Journal of Law and Inequality, or JLI, as it's known here at the law school, which is our second oldest law journal. It's just 1 year shy of its 40th anniversary. It's run by our wonderful students, and they've put in so much work to put this conference together, along with our Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity and their co-host, Georgetown Law's Workers' Rights Institute, and they've done so much to not just plan this organize the summit, but to adjust to the global pandemic and move us to a virtual platform. So with that, I hope that you will join me in giving them a virtual round of applause. If we were all together, I know that I'd be hearing you cheer. And unfortunately, we're not able to do that, but I do want to take this time to make sure that all the people behind the scenes who have made this conference, this summit happen, we appreciate you, we thank you, and a special thank you to our co-chairs, who you just met, Yolanda Melville of the Cooper Levinson firm in New Jersey, and the chair of the NAACP Next Gen Alumni Association, and Professor Ted Shaw from the University of North Carolina Law School. We're so proud to partner with you. The University of Minnesota Law School is really proud of this work. We're committed to being at the forefront of advocating for positive change in the lives of Black Americans, of people of color, of marginalized communities and workers. And I wish you all a great summer. Thank you. I'm looking at the clock. I think I've done my job, which was just to be a little bit of a filler to allow our attendees numbers to climb. I see them climbing. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our co-host. Thank you, welcome, have a great summit. Let's let the important work begin.
Thank you so much, and it's good to see you virtually. We want to, or I want to, do a brief introduction of Bishop Reginald Thomas Jackson, who is the 132nd elected and consecrated bishop of the AME Church. He has a much longer bio, and I think that you have access to it. All I want to say is that at this moment, we're reminded again of the role of the faith community in the civil rights movement, and he comes from that tradition and has served the communities in which he has lived and beyond for a long time now. I could say much more about him, his role as executive director of the Black Ministers Council of New Jersey. But rather than hear me introduce him, I think what we want to do is hear his reflections as he helps to take us into this summit. Reverend Jackson, are you there? Bishop,
yes, I am. Yes, I am.
All right, good to see you. God bless you, and thank you for being with us, Bishop.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this invitation and opportunity, and look forward to participating in this summit. Let me give just a few moments of spiritual reflection. There are a few words found in the book of Acts, the 17th chapter and the 26th verse, that I want to base my reflection on. The Apostle Paul was in Athens, where he was being ridiculed and mocked because of his beliefs. And one of the Epicureans and philosophers needled him, asking, "What would this babbler wish to say?" So the Apostle Paul stood and preached this sermon on Mars Hill. And this is what he said: "Out of one blood, God has made all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth. Paul said God did this. It was not coincidence. It didn't just happen. But the sovereign and creator God deliberately made all men out of one blood to dwell together on the earth. This was his design and intention for creation, which he had made. Man made from the dust of the earth. Racism and segregation are sinful. In fact, racism is a dust problem. And how dare one shade of dust think it's better or superior than another shade of dust? And now here we are, since creation, still debating and suffering the consequences of our determination to alter God's will for us. To put it plainly, here we are in the United States, still battling segregation and racism, still trying to justify separation and discrimination. In other words, we are still in sin. And I repeat, segregation and racism are sin. Anything and everything that violates and fights against God's word and will is sin. God made man of one blood to live together, not separated, not divided, not polarized, but together, to be the koinonia, the beloved community. We cannot be the beloved community segregated with bias, discriminating against one another. We are in a battle against demonic forces, and this summit is necessary because this fight is not over. The last decade has been a difficult time for those of us who are committed to civil and human rights, who seek to accomplish God's will. And this year has been made more difficult as we have lost 3 of the generals, 3 of the champions of civil rights, all of whom I was blessed to know personally. Dr. Joseph Lowry, the Reverend Corey Tindall Vivian, and Congressman John Lewis, also an ordained minister whose life we celebrate even as I speak. Each of them gave their lives to the kingdom of God on earth. This summit must call us, each of us, to recommit ourselves to do the same, to advance God's kingdom on earth. In fact, we must become more committed, more passionate, more determined to win this battle. For the foes of civil rights are more committed, more passionate, and more determined to turn back time, to resurrect pre-civil rights, pre-voting rights, pre-Great Society days. The mantra, "Make America Great Again," is a not too subtle call to return to a period when white supremacy, white privilege, and white men controlling power was prevalent. And this is not a physical battle, but at its root, it is a spiritual problem. Racism, white supremacy, white privilege are opposed to God's plan and will in creation. As the Apostle Paul warned the believers in Ephesus, so too does he warn us today. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness in high places. In the highest office in the land, in this administration, in this Congress, all across this country, there are people in positions who seek to undo policies, insert policies, make decisions, and take actions that advance segregation and racism. These are difficult times, And I cannot emphasize enough, these are difficult times to be Black and people of color. We are shot jogging while Black, killed while Black with the knees of law enforcement on our necks, executed while Black, sleeping in our own homes, shot while Black, and unarmed running away from police. Hate crimes are increasing all over the nation, and so is segregation. School systems are more segregated. Our economy is more segregated. And yesterday, our international embarrassment, who resides in the house that Black hands, reiterated his intention to expand segregated housing. This summit calls us to action because it seems as if the devil is having his way. In this environment, this summit, we must move, we must plan, organize, and unite in order to impact policy while protesting, organize to combat voter suppression while producing maximum voter turnout, maintaining pressure while at the same time changing police culture, reform our public schools so the children not only get a diploma, but also a quality education, strategize so we can not only get a job, but also be entrepreneurs and business owners. We must advance equal opportunity for all. Through our protest and organizing, we must not only produce heat, but also light. In a word, we must make sure that not only do Black lives matter, but that Black lives also count. Count in the census, count at the polls, count in the classroom, count not only as consumers, but also investors, count in law enforcement and the judiciary. Black lives not only matter, but our lives must also count. Last year, I was invited to preach at a conference in Jackson, Mississippi. As I checked in the hotel in the lobby, an elderly woman stopped me and asked me a question that shook me, that I have not been able to forget. She asked me this question: Bishop Jackson, does the church still matter? Nothing for the advancement of Blacks in this country occurred without the leadership of the Black church. From the American Revolution and the founding of the AME Church, through slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, it was the Black church, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, that provided the leadership for Blacks and produced our leadership. What an honor roll it is. The Black church was called the conscience of the nation. The greatest period of growth in the history of the Black church was when the Black church was more socially active. It was during the Civil Rights Movement. You couldn't get a seat in the Black church on Sunday morning. It was because the Black church was engaged in kingdom work. It advocated and worked to end segregation and inequality. It was about freedom and doing the will of God. But over the last 40 years, the focus and priority of the Black church has changed. Over these last 40 years, the Black church has become caught up with what I call the obsession of praise. Everything centers on praising God. Today, the Black church says praise is what we do. Our children are not getting a quality education, but we can't get involved in that because praise is what we do. Every 26 hours, a Black is shot by somebody in law enforcement, but we can't get involved in that because praise is what we do. Poverty is increasing in our community. Black banks are closing. Quality of life is decreasing. But we can't get involved in that because praise is what we do. But may I remind you, there is a praise that turns God off. Listen to what the word of God says in the book of Amos, 5th chapter, 21st to the 24th verses. This is what God says. I despise your feast days. I have no regard for your solemn assemblies. Though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Take away from me the noise of your songs and the melody of your stringed instruments, I will not hear. But let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. God not only requires us to praise him, anybody with good sense will praise him, but God also requires us to serve him. To praise God but not serve God makes us cynical. To serve God and not praise God makes us ungrateful. May this summit move us not only to praise God, but also to serve God. The days ahead will be difficult and challenging. The forces of segregation and racism will continue to seek to divide and pit against each other. We will have to fight the system work for us. I tell you, it will be hard, but harder yet may be the fight. Right may often yield to might. Wickedness a while may reign. Satan's cause may seem to gain, but there is a God, and he rules above with a hand of power and a heart of love. And if we're right, and I believe we're right, he'll fight our battles, and we will be victorious one day. Let's fight the good fight. Thank you so much, and all God's best. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Jackson, for those profound words. Being an Episcopalian, I celebrate the bond between the AME's founder, Richard Allen, and Absalom Jones, the first Black priest of the American Episcopal Church. They were abolitionists, and if they were alive today, they'd be right here. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues and students, distinguished guests and speakers. I am Mark Gaston Pierce, Executive Director of the Workers' Rights Institute at Georgetown University's Law School, and the former chairman of the National Labor Relations Board under the Obama administration. We at the Workers' Rights Institute are proud to be co-hosting this third annual Civil Rights Summit, along with Dean Garry Jenkins and the University of Minnesota Law School. William Traynor, Dean of Georgetown's Law School, will be extending his greeting at the commencement tomorrow. Special thanks to the very energized students and staff of the University of Minnesota Law School and its Journal of Law and Inequality, as well as the students of the Black Law Students Association and the Labor and Employment Law Society at Georgetown Law for helping to facilitate this event. Pandemic, policing, and protests highlight the state of affairs. While we mourn the loss of a warrior for civil rights, John Lewis, and the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, we also remember the death from COVID-19 of 27-year-old grocery clerk Leilani Jordan, right near here in Maryland, who kept working through the pandemic even though she was a disabled person and her job was at risk. Although the store offered no PPE and she had to bring her own hand sanitizer to work, She told her mom she wanted to continue working because she wanted to help people. Her last paycheck was in the amount of $20.64. The vulnerable have been deemed essential, and the essential are low-wage workers who are predominantly people of color. And it is they that are dying. It is time for us to raise them up and to bring it all together and to help them. The Workers' Rights Institute was created in part from the recognition that workers' rights are civil rights, that racial justice and economic justice are inseparable causes. Accordingly, the Workers' Rights Institute has been launching initiatives and collaborations with the objective of empowering low-wage workers of color and facilitating their access to resources. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last crusade in Memphis was as much a struggle about workers' rights as it was about racial justice. The great labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, was a principal architect of the storied March on Washington in 1968. And today, just a few weeks ago, 60 different labor organizations and social justice organizations organized a nationwide strike for Black lives, where essential workers from Boston to San Francisco walked off their jobs and took to the streets to demand racial and economic justice. It is all coming together under one roof because the goals are the same. So as we discuss, debate, and deliberate, let us remember the words of A. Philip Randolph. Salvation for race, nation, or class must come from within. Freedom is never granted. It is won. Justice is never given. It is exacted. Thank you very much and welcome and enjoy this great summit. Here's my friend John Brittain to describe the purpose and objectives of the summit. John.
Good afternoon. I am John Brittain. Like Charles Hamilton Houston, the legal father of the Brown versus Education theory that de jure segregation was inherently a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, I have kept one foot in the classroom teaching law and the other foot in the courtroom litigating civil rights cases for the last 51 years. I will give you an overview of the Civil Rights Summit 2020. In an opinion editorial by Congressman John Lewis, published at his request today of his funeral, in the New York Times, he wrote, "Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society." Here's the background on the summits. This is the third summit of Civil Rights Summit, the first at the University of Minnesota Law School, as Dean Jenkins so adequately described, with a call to action against enduring racial disparities and growing economic inequality tied to our racially segregated structure of opportunity and power. Last May 2019, we held our second Summit for Civil Rights at Rutgers Labor Center in New Brunswick, New Jersey, with an event of even a bigger gathering of some of the nation's top thinkers and organizers and leaders. We used it to expand our coalition, sharpen our weapons, and to launch statewide fights against racial segregation in places like New Jersey and Minnesota. This is the action of the summits over the years. Today, in our third series of Civil Rights Summits, the time being held virtually, it comes during a global pandemic, a national uprising against racial injustice and murder. And it comes at a time of unprecedented political turmoil and a crisis of national leadership. And only days after the death of two of our greatest living leaders in the civil rights era, C.T. Vivian and John Lewis. The purpose of this summit is not to talk, but to act. C.T. Vivian was also head of the Southern Leadership Conference that started as a conference, but it was an organizing conference that moved into a calculated and strategic action that broke the back of Jim Crow segregation. Here's an overview. We have 5 conversations over the next 2 days with breaks in between. You should all have schedules with different Zoom links for each one. First, the conversation is about power, called Multiracial America and Black Power. From Black Lives to Black Power, featuring Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. We cannot defeat segregation without power, so we will start with that and look at how Black voters and elected leaders are creating new opportunities for broad progressive coalitions across the nation. The second conversation is about the harms of segregation and what it means today, 52 years since the Kerner Commission report and 57 since the March on Washington. Why have we tolerated it and what have been the costs? The next conversation, our third, will talk about who benefits from racial divide, segregation as a lucrative business model. We will explore the profiteers in finance, housing, and schools who have a stake in a profit motive in maintaining the status quo of segregation. We will hear from Congressman Bobby Scott, the powerful chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee. The fourth conversation will be about where we go from here. It will talk about the opportunity today in the wake of the crisis, the uprisings, and the toppling of statues to re-image and build a new America. To help ground us in the conversation, we will hear from a number of scholars. The final conversation will be about how we make this work. How do we build and maintain bridges, coalitions, and infrastructure for the work that needs to be done? And how do we avoid allowing the transformative moment to become not just another moment, but a movement? That conversation will be held by Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, and we will end with a call to action by Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP. After a brief break, Professor Meyer Orfield of the University of Minnesota Law School will moderate the first panel discussion. Ted Shaw, are you going to come back on for a transition?
You said everything that needed to be said. So, Professor Shaw, do you have anything else to add before we transition to our break? You're muted.
This is the kind of thing that will happen, so bear with us. I just want to thank John Brittain, my colleague, my friend, Professor Brittain. I want to thank Bishop Jackson. I want to thank Mark Pierce for getting us started. And other than that, we'll take a brief break. I believe we're scheduled to begin the first panel discussion at 2:15. Am I right about that? Yolanda, I think I am. And so everybody has the Zoom link available, and please click on that link. Again, as Professor Brittain said, you'll need to click on the Zoom link for each session. And so we look forward to seeing you at 2:15. That's all I have for now.
So come back at 2:15 and there will be a new Zoom link for that panel. Thank you again.
Ready to begin?
Yes, I believe so.
And is Keith connected yet?
I can't find his name in the.
Yeah, they seem to be sending signals of their, under Keon Dosti, KeaondoUsti. There he is, okay. So I think we're ready to start.
Yeah, I think we're ready.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for their patience with this. We're still getting the flaws out of this system. My name is Myron Orfield, and I am a professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School and the director of the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity. I am going to have the privilege of introducing Keith Ellison here today. In many ways, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is the personification of the theme of this event. He's a great American leader in the effort to reunite the civil rights and labor movement and renew the push for racial and economic justice. Last year's summit examined recent trends in American electoral politics and the critical importance of Black voters and Black leadership in the last 4 years of national elections and the implications for building a sustained multiracial movement for progress. We're trying to understand what we've learned since then and how does the recent outpouring of energy and anger around racial justice inform our thinking about political power and the opportunities to build Black-led multiracial power to change America. What have we learned from the nation's elections, the recent elections, about the role of race and racism and the Black electorate, including populist insurgencies on both the left and the right? What have the recent and unprecedented outpourings of anger and activism tell us about what opportunities are created for multiracial and Black-led leadership in building working class power to fight racial segregation, economic discrimination, and all the injustices that our society confronts? Yesterday, the president declared his intention to repeal important fair housing rules that many of the people that attended this conference worked on for many years. These rules were an effort after 50 years to begin to implement the promise of the Fair Housing Act. In doing so, he decided to build another wall, not a border with another country, but between communities in every metropolitan area of the United States. This is the first president who has decided to take on the very basis of the Fair Housing Act and explicitly endorse continued racial segregation. The president in his message talked a lot about low-income housing, but everyone in this room knows that the Obama rules were about much more. They were about freedom from mortgage lending discrimination and insurance discrimination, steering, blockbusting, and about protecting racially integrated communities from becoming resegregated. President Obama's rules were about the very notion of choice and allowing non-whites in America to live where they want, subject to the same rights and obligations as white Americans. As the president renews his call for segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, however, he faces a much different America than George Wallace did in 1968. In 1968, the suburbs were all white and minorities lived in the cities. Non-white Americans lived in the cities. Today, the suburbs are racially diverse. More than half of Black and Latinos choose to live in the suburbs, and 2/3 of African Americans and Latinos who have incomes above the median income. Almost half of suburbanites, white and Black and Latino, live in suburban communities that are racially diverse, twice as many Americans as live in predominantly white suburban communities. These diverse suburban communities have twice as many congressmen and legislators as the majority white suburbs. These suburban communities lack protection from things like steering and mortgage lending discrimination. The Fair Housing Act protects them as much as it protects anyone in the United States. Yet yesterday, the president declared that non-white Americans have no right to live in any of these suburbs, that they should leave their communities and never come back. He declared that no matter how hard they try and no matter what they accomplish, they don't deserve to live in communities with whites. When the president seeks to repeal rules that carry out the Fair Housing Act, he not only builds a wall of segregation, but by withdrawing protection from steering and mortgage lending and blockbusting and insurance and banking discrimination, he threatens one of the largest parts of American suburbia. Without these protections, diverse suburbs will have a tendency to resegregate and be redlined in the same way that urban communities have been. This conference must work to unite the cities in the diverse suburbs and build and strengthen power between this large share of suburbia and the central cities in America. In this struggle and all the other struggles for reform we will discuss today and tomorrow, there lies the possibility of a new multiracial politics for civil and economic rights. We have an ability to show America that civil and economic rights are not just moral issues, but they are strong central political issues necessary to deal with America's present and future existence. In this struggle, we realize that Barack Obama, as a Black multiracial leader of America, is not a one-off, is not a coincidence, but he's a model for the future of American politics. This conference is filled with Black leaders who represent multiracial constituencies. And in many ways, they are the strongest advocates of civil rights and economic reform in America. These leaders deeply understand the harms of existing, unredressed illegal discrimination, and their political experience and savvy understands the intricate structure and potential power of a multiracial constituency. They understand America itself. Today, Keith Ellison stands at the very center of our nation's future. George Floyd died here, and his death brought massive demonstrations here and in over 200 cities throughout the nation. Today, Keith Ellison will tell us whether this moment, that has again revealed more than 50 years of unredressed racial and economic discrimination, will be a catalyst for reform of civil rights and economic rights, or will it be another moment like the moments surrounding the beating of Rodney King or Hurricane Katrina, or so many other police shootings that have occurred in the past? Will they represent a symbol of hope, a symbol of action, or will they result in another false acquiescence on our part to political powerlessness? It's my great privilege to give you our great Attorney General, Keith Ellison.
Okay, let me unmute. Okay, good. Now, how do I mute? Are we muted? You're unmuted. Am I unmuted? Good to go. How's everybody? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, good morning. And Myron, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I want to say thank you very much to everybody assembled, all of the distinguished leaders, people who are new to the movement and are fired up and ready to bring real change, and people who have been around for a while, ready to continue bringing forth change and ready to give advice and counsel to our youngest members of this movement who are in the streets every day, bringing forth justice, freedom, accountability in this system. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you. Today, I want to talk about this civil rights moment, and I want to address the issue of solidarity and Black power. The fact is that this civil rights movement requires effective, concerted, unrelenting agitation in the street, in the courtroom, in the legislature, in the city councils, all driving toward justice, no looking back. It needs to be sustained, it needs to be persistent, it needs to be uncompromising on the issue of justice. And to do that, we have to have a proper understanding of what the moment is now and what is required of us to make maximum use of the moment that we're in. Let me just set the scene here. How do I go to the next one? I want to first of all start the conversation where it should start. right now. On this day that we are laying the great John Lewis to rest, only a few hours ago, really, we had a US senator say, quote, "We have to study the history of slavery and the impact on the development of our country because otherwise we can't understand our country. As founding fathers said, it was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built. But the fact is, there was nothing necessary about slavery. Anybody who says it was necessary is absolutely wrong. The dehumanization of literally millions of Americans for 250 years in slavery and then another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation was not necessary. It was what was done because it privileged some, and those some who were privileged were happy to dehumanize others in order to get privileges for themselves. It wasn't necessary. And the justification to say it was necessary by Senator Cotton is even scarier, because there is a project called the 1619 Project where scholars are trying to help correct the historical record, and it is his effort to stop it. That's where we are right here, right now, and that sets us. Also this, let me talk about this one. Now this just came down the pipe, yesterday. President Trump says with universal mail in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most inaccurate, fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Now here's the point I want you to focus on. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, safely vote. In other words, delay the election until he can win. He's talking about delaying the election. So we have a US senator openly arguing that it was necessary to dehumanize millions of Americans to benefit the slaveocracy. And we have the sitting president who says, delay the election because it doesn't look good for him now. This civil rights moment is a moment in which the United States can experience a brand new beginning, a new renaissance of true democracy that is inclusive of all, or it can experience authoritarianism, racialized authoritarianism. And it is essential that we grasp the moment so that we can make the most out of the moment, so that we can not just go back to how it was before COVID, before George Floyd, but bring ourselves to brand new heights that we've never really seen before, but which are within our grasp if we can answer this question: solidarity or Black power? The truth is, it's not or, it's and it's always been and. Black power and human solidarity go together because of one very simple, I believe, irrefutable fact. And that is that it is the suppression and the oppression of Black people in America from the very beginning that has allowed the people who control our society to divide our society and to weaken us all. Black empowerment, Black Lives Matter, Black power is necessary to bring up America's people to a point of parity and equality and equity so that we can come together and not be divided against each other, so that we can make a demand on a society for our mutual aid and benefit. But while Black people are kept in a state of suppression and oppression and exclusion and segregation, we are just easy to be exploited. It's easy to divide one against the other. It's easy to go to whites and say, those people who you don't know who live over there don't deserve anything because they're bad. You can promote stereotype, you can promote lies, but it's all based upon the disempowerment of Black people. Disempowerment of Black people allowed the election in Florida in the year 2000 to scrub the voting rolls in Florida of Black voters, so that that election, which George Bush lost, to go in his favor to the detriment of the entire country, so that he could push through a big pharma prescription drug bill, so that he can completely screw up the tragedy of 9/11 and not deal with it in a way that it really should have been dealt with, so that he could totally mess up Katrina and environmental regulation and cut taxes on the wealthiest and push the burden on to the rest of us. It was race and racism that allowed that to happen. We can talk about this more and more, but let me start with the moment that we're in. This is a picture of John Lewis getting beat by the Alabama State Troopers. This happened in March. By August of that year, because we were able to build the basis of a multiracial coalition, we put ourselves in a position where we could pass the Voting Rights Act. And understand this about the Voting Rights Act. White people benefited from the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act allowed people who were historically denied a say in their own governance to have a say, to send forward representatives like John Lewis, who would vote for health care for everybody, education for everybody, investment in the state for everybody, this Voting Rights Act, which John Lewis helped to pass, not only helped Black people long denied the opportunity to participate in American life, but it allowed representatives to go to Congress and other places so that those same representatives can pass legislation that benefited working class Americans of all colors. John Lewis, right here, he says, I gave a little blood on that bridge in Selma, Alabama for the right to vote. I'm not going to stand by and let that Supreme Court take the right to vote away from us. But only a few short, but now just a few short months ago, John Lewis's career is instructive for us because he, as an activist, just like the activists now, as a young activist, he was out there fighting for the right to vote, got beat down for it, and some people lost their lives. But now as we lay him to rest, only a few years ago, his dream of everybody participating in the balance, hanging in the balance because of cases like Shelby County. The US Supreme Court strikes down key part of the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act in danger 1 year, Shelby County Supreme Court. Welcome to the first presidential election where the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. And then at the bottom, how Shelby County versus Holder broke America. That spans the life of John Lewis. John Lewis has gone on to his reward. The question for us today is, can we embrace Black power, Black Lives Matter, build that multiracial solidarity on the basis of equity and parity, and then work together to pass a true piece of legislation that allows all Americans to govern themselves. Let's talk about this issue. Power is key. Empowerment of Black people is key to everyone. Black power is not anywhere the same as white power, no matter what the races say, because Black people are coming from a place of complete and total disempowerment. White power means more power to people who already have it. Black power means power to people who've never had it. Why is power important? If a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he's got the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is a question not of attitude, but a question of power. You want to talk about power? Let's talk a little about power. Here's power.
Please don't come close to me. Please don't come close to me. Please don't come close to me. Please call the cops. Please call the cops. I'm in trouble. There's an African-American man threatening my life. I'm sorry, I'm in a ramble, and there's a man, African American, who's a bicycle helmet. He's recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African American man, I'm in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
Why do I say that's power? Because that lady knows that all she has to do is say, saw Black man's doing something to her, and police will show up, and there's a fair chance that that man will be arrested, and there is actually an outside chance that he will be killed. It certainly would not be the first time that it ever happened. That is social power. Until we have a movement-wide ethic of Black Lives Matter, Black Power, until we say nobody can simply have their life ended and their freedom taken away based on the say-so of some person, then we don't have a real movement. The destruction of white supremacy within the progressive movement and within America is essential to the freedom for us all. The truth is, we all know this woman here, she's not a Klans member, she's not a neo-Nazi, she's not a racist. She probably has Black friends, and she might have even dated a Black person at some point. Bottom line is, she knew that if some Black person annoyed her, she could rain hell down on them. And she's not the only one, and we all know it. If you doubt it, look at this. Negroes indicted on charges of rape. That's the Scottsboro boys. 3 Negroes lynched. That's the Duluth lynching. This is Donald Trump's, one of his early forays into politics. Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police, sign Donald Trump at the bottom. A man jailed for 3 years without a trial, kills himself. That's the Browder case. Bottom line is, we know that this phenomenon of Black people being able to simply have their lives erased on whim of a white person is historic, and it is modern. And we've got to have Black empowerment, Black Lives Matter, in order to create the solidarity we need to have a unified movement to make the change we need for all of us. 3 Negroes lynched in Duluth. And now, just a few weeks ago, because of the Voting Rights Act, because we have made some progress in fighting and beating down the hard metal of total racism, we were able to have African Americans be in positions of power to help grant a posthumous pardon. This is a product of our movement. It is what can happen, but the thing is, yes, we can pardon somebody who was murdered 100 years ago. Can we stop somebody being murdered today or tomorrow or the next week? That's the real question. We will see. Here's the thing to understand about solidarity, multiracial solidarity, and Black power. Fred Hampton said it best. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight it with solidarity. Of course we need solidarity. Absolutely we need solidarity. But we cannot have total solidarity if African Americans unite with the rest of the working class at the bottom all over again. Let me give you a little sense of how bad things really are. When, there is no racial symmetry. There are no black and white mirror images of each other. There is a very unequal and clearly distinct difference. Racial wealth inequality is rampant in the US. White people who are in the blue upper line, they see their wealth above $100,000 in '83, $161,000 in 2010 almost. Whereas if you go down here, Black wealth, what, 68,000 in '83, Latino wealth, 4,000. Now, or in 2009, it was around 10,000, and it remains down there. I mean, when you think about this inequality in the racial wealth gap, you've got to ask yourself, what does that mean in terms of how much of a person's income goes to their rent? Or what does that mean in terms of home ownership? What does that mean in terms of education? What does that mean in terms of enriching after school activities? What does that mean in terms of sports? What does that mean in terms of kids participating in other enriching activities that help build their educational background? What does that mean in terms of their healthcare? What does that mean in terms of who's insured and who's not? What it means in terms of who's insured, but they have insurance, it might be cheap, but it doesn't really cover anything. It means it has everything to do with a multitude of life indicators. Home ownership, more common among whites than other racial and ethnic groups. Oh, well, when you think about the history of redlining and restrictive covenants. That's not surprising. Blacks still more than twice as likely to be poor than whites are. No doubt. I mean, of course they do. Our country, Black people are not so much poor as they are impoverished. Northern cities have the greatest racial home ownership gaps. And then you have the president literally bragging about how he opposes low-income housing and how he's not going to try to affirmatively further fair housing just yesterday. Why is he doing this? To exacerbate the isolation, separation, and segregation between the races, because he knows that if you're a white suburbanite who doesn't have any contact with Black people, it's a hell of a lot easier to vilify, demonize, and blame those Black people for the condition that they are in. Lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. Look at it for yourselves. All men, 1 in 9. White men, 1 in 17. I mean, the numbers are outrageous. For Black people, white people, the racial disparities in sentencing are dramatic and they are impoverishing. Anybody who has a loved one in prison knows that their income is gone to your household. You know then that the calls that they make to your house are expensive. Helping put money on their commissary books is very expensive. Even sending them money, they will charge you to send them. You have to pay to keep your loved one in soap and toothpaste if they are in prison. It is an impoverishing experience to have a loved one in prison. US maternal death rate, look at that. Just escalating right there. Now, what does it mean? That means Black women not getting health care. That means Black women not getting prenatal care. That means Black women being in food deserts. It means Black women being uninsured. It means oppression. If you want to improve healthcare outcomes for Black women, you will improve healthcare outcomes for everybody. So with that, I just wanted to tell you.
I must say to you, you have a role to play. You've been called. You've been chosen to play a role. You must play it so well, as Dr. King would say, that no one else could play it any better.
So I want to close on the immortal words of John Lewis. We need you to build racial solidarity by lifting up people who have been historically oppressed. That means the mantra of our movement must be Black Lives Matter, and it also must be racial solidarity for all. We need you to be a fierce fighter for healthcare for every person. I believe in Medicare for all, but whatever version you are in favor of, we need it. We need you to house everyone affordably. We need you to make sure that our economy, as it goes green equitably. We need to make sure that, yes, as we legalize marijuana, that the people who've been incarcerated for having it are now also benefiting economically for that. So at the end of the day, you all will come up with a very important set of prescriptions. But the most important thing right now is not your intellectual prowess. It's not your written plans. We have great scholars who can come up with all that. What we need you to do now is what John Lewis would have you do: make good trouble and go get in the way. God bless. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I wanted to thank Attorney General Ellison for his eloquent opening remarks and passionate opening remarks. Now we're going to turn to our panel. And this panel, we'd like to have a conversation where everyone will talk for 2 or 3 minutes so we have some time for questions. I know that's a little bit of time, but I know you're capable of doing that and having a rich discussion afterwards. First, I want to turn to Davita Russell, who's a councilwoman in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and the president of the Northeast Ohio District of the Ohio Association of Public School Employees. Councilmember Russell, you are not only a powerful labor leader over a 10-county area, but you recently ran for and won an at-large council seat in a very diverse suburb of Cleveland, joining a growing number of African-American leaders in suburbs across the country. We have heard all about how important Black voters are, especially Black women in elections. When we look at a state like Ohio and its polarized politics, how important is it for leaders like you and leaders who look like you to break through in more towns, counties, and legislative districts that are diverse and even majority white?
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much for having me today. You know, pivotal and powerful are very strong and important words. And for me, powerful is staying true to myself and understanding that the only approval that I need is from God and my conscience, and speaking truth to power. You know, I learned at a very early age when my mother removed me from a high school that was predominantly, well, truly all African American, to go to a multiracial high school, because her thought pattern was I could not live with Blacks alone. I had to learn to live in a world where there was diversity. Where she was a part-time school bus driver for the developmental disability, and she dropped us off every morning in front of the school. Can you imagine what our thought process was at that time? It was racial diversity, but we were not wanted in that school. And we ran every single day home from school from racism. And at that early age, I learned that as a Black woman, when I enter a room, everything walks in that room with me, from the Blackness of my skin, from the texture of my hair, to an underlying difference in intelligence, my temperament, my physical power and attributes, my sexuality, and even the stereotypes of the people in the room to what they perceive of Black people. And being a Black woman running for an election and being a leader of a large part of a union is very important because it's multicultural and diverse. But Black women's issues has not become a priority in politics. And for us to gain power, we have to have Black politicians, Black leaders, so that Black issues will not be tossed aside, that they will not be ignored, and that the true Black power life experience will come to life in legislation and policies across all levels of this community, as far as the state, local, and federal government.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fletcher, Bill Fletcher Jr., I want to ask you a question now. You're a labor leader and a political organizer who's thought a lot about the question of Black power in white-dominated institutions like labor, as well as populist and pro-worker political movements like the last two Sanders campaigns. What are we not seeing here, and what are we missing and losing out as a country by not being able to reconcile our economic populism with racial justice and Black political power?
Thank you for inviting me to be in this program, first of all. The question is an enormous one. So let me just, in the interest of time, take a couple of pieces. One is that when you're talking about populist movements, one of the problems is that, with the important exception of the Rainbow Coalition in the 1980s under Jesse Jackson, most populist movements begin with the assumption or the myth of unity. In other words, they posit that the people, however they define the people, are in opposition to an elite. And while that may be true, what populism all too often ignores are the deep divisions that exist among the people. So it begins with this myth, and as opposed to recognizing that we are divided, and there's a particular reason for that, it tries to ignore that. And so you see in a number of campaigns that have emerged over time, this idea that we should all unite around a common economic program. And while there is truth to that, if that program doesn't specifically identify the way racist oppression operates, then what you have is a false unity, a false solidarity. And I think that that's one of the problems in many populist movements and in much of organized labor, which means that one of the critical things is that we've got to understand the historical foundation of race and racism and its link with the development of capitalism. This is not about getting people to like each other, to feel better about each other, to taste and love each other's food. This is about understanding how the larger powers that be have been very successful in creating a differential in treatment between racialized populations, African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Asians, et cetera, right? And so-called whites. And when I say so-called whites, because not all Europeans automatically become white, which is a whole other story. So the powers that be have been very successful in keeping people divided up in order to ensure that they, the powers that be, are able to continue to dominate. That is part of the lesson that needs to be integrated into every social movement. And so when we start talking about Black power, for example, in social movements like in organized labor, it's among other things, it's the power, the demonstrable power to influence change and not simply be a symbol. It's not just holding a position, it's the ability to be central to the all-round discussions of an organization or a movement. All the discussions about strategy and not just dealing with the Negro question, not just dealing with race, right? But dealing with the totality of it. And that's when you'll start to see some Black power.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm now going to turn to the Reverend James Woodall, who's the state president of the Georgia NAACP. Major Woodall, you are the youngest state conference leader in the history of the NAACP. You're not only leading the NAACP statewide, but you've run for office in a district that was far from a majority-minority district in the terms of the Voting Rights Act. Why did you do that? Do you see a path for yourself and other Black leaders for gaining more power at the state in the coming years? And why is that important? What is there to gain, and what, if anything, is there to lose?
So first, thank you for that question, and I'm grateful to be here, and to my distinguished colleagues on this panel, and to the Honorable Keith Ellison, good afternoon. One, I really don't know why I ran. See, quite honestly, I was a college student, and I was, quite frankly, tired of politicians coming into our communities, asking for our support, and then go into their legislative offices and do whatever it is that they want. I recall, then we were talking about guns on campus. I was a senator in the student government at Georgia Southern University, and we had taken a position, overwhelming 97% of our entire student body agreed to not have guns on campus. However, the state representative at the time, who still is currently in office, voted in favor of it. And so I said, well, if we're not going to have a representative that represents our voice, we must have someone else step up to the plate. And that's exactly what I did. I had done no data diving. I did not have a team. I didn't put together any analysis on my candidate. I just simply said there was an issue with representation, so I stepped up to the plate. That really started my political career. And I do believe, this is a moment where we can have a very honest conversation about leadership. But I don't know if the conversation needs to be started by what does it take to get power, but rather what are we actually looking to gain in this moment? For me, it's about the humanity of all people. And right now we have too many groups of people who are human beings who are being treated as less than human beings and therefore dehumanized and oppressed. And so the very first start, because we have Black people in power. I live here in the city of Atlanta now, and this is a majority African-American leadership community. And the fact still remains is that we have poverty. We have inaccess to healthcare and economic opportunity. We have, miseducation of the Negro, in the words of Carter G. Woodson. And so we really have to be honest about what it is that we're asking for, be very consistent in not only our ideological perspectives, but also how we really build the kind of movement that not only reflects what is the antithesis to oppression and dehumanization, but in fact, what does it mean to be human, and how do we make that happen in real life, in real time? So I think that's really where we are as a movement, and I'm willing to do what I can do to make that happen.
Thank you very much. We've got a few questions from the audience, and if there anyone else would like to send in questions, please do this. One of the questions, would you mind clarifying, and I direct this to each of the panelists, what does power mean? What does political power mean? And how do we think about creating multiracial political power? Maybe we can start with Attorney General Ellison.
Well, power means the ability to control your life. Power means that if you want to pursue your education, you can do that. Power means you can walk through the streets of your neighborhood and not be negatively impacted by law enforcement as long as you're not doing anything. It means that you can be treated fairly within the criminal justice system. It means that you will be protected by the instrumentality of the law. And it also means that you will not be persecuted by the instrumentality of the law. It means that you have the ability to, if you want to apply yourself to buy a home, you work hard and you get the money and you buy one. It's important to talk about what the absence of power is too. Because if you've always had power, it's like water. Does the fish notice the water? No. If you're a white person, you don't really feel what it means necessarily to be oppressed by police brutality. You might, I'm not saying never, but if you're a Black person, there is an ever-present sense that any time a flashing light is behind you, it can have a deadly consequence. So power is breathing free, living free, going to the doctor, telling the doctor that this hurts and getting proper treatment for that pain. That's what it is. What is the absence of power? The absence of power means that you can be sick as a dog and your only option is the emergency room. The absence of power is you show up to your kid's school, not only are the desks all broken, and if you're in a northern climate, the schools are freezing. If you're in a hot southern climate, the schools are cooking, and the teacher's got the TV on, and the school has 50 kids in the classroom. And they're not teaching anything that's going to help your child. I mean, these are the things. Powerlessness is living in a tent near the roadside. Powerlessness is living next to a plant spewing out cadmium, mercury, and lead, which you complaining about does almost nothing to change. So these are the dynamics of power. It's not a theoretical thing. It's a real thing. But in a segregated world, people on the upside of the segregation can't conceive of what the people on the other side are living through. And the people who are on the bottom side of the power dynamic, to them, that's their life. So to them, not being nervous when the police pull you over is an unthinkable thing as well. This is why I believe we need to have solidarity in our movements, because people have got to be able to share with each other what their lives are like so that we can build some empathy, some solidarity, some joint action, and true allyship. So that's my take on it.
Go ahead, Mr. Woodall. I think you're raising your hand. Would you like to answer that question too?
Most definitely. So my challenge, though, with the notion of power, and I'll go by defining, I think what General Ellison has just shared is what it means to be human, to be able to do those things. And what we've experienced is the absence of, to his point, the absence of power. But the challenge is, if we have not actually dealt with the fact that there is oppression. So if I, as a Black man, or as we as Black people, get nothing but power so we can do these things, we have not addressed the actual elephant in the room, that there are still communities that are experiencing that reality. And so, though I do agree with him that, you know, being able to do those things and being able to determine what you experience on a day-to-day basis as a community is important, I guess my position on the question of what power is a deconstruction and a destruction of all kinds of oppression, because in the absence of justice, regardless if it's impacting me or not, you still do not have power, because there's still somebody in the ethic of Ubuntu, there's still somebody being oppressed. And so if we're talking about racial solidarity, we're talking about building a movement that is actually able to articulate what the needs of human beings are, we have to address that. Say, for instance, we are able to get the kind of Black liberation that we're pushing for. The reality is there's still even oppression within the Black community that we have not addressed. We still have Black trans women. We still have Black women who are still experiencing the level of oppression that is reminiscent of a kind of dehumanizing culture. And so if we really want to have power, it has to be destroyed so that all people can be able to have equitable access to life and life more abundantly. That is the only way. And again, this isn't theoretical. We have to start from a framework of where we believe the world should be, and then how do we make that happen? There are very real, practical ways that we can equalize the playing field so that everybody has access to quote unquote power and access and life more abundantly. So I just wanted to offer that in addition to what he shared.
Another question that's come up is the Trump administration has announced plans to suspend Obama's fair housing rule tomorrow. And they're arguing that integration is not part of the Fair Housing Act. It's just about discrimination against individuals. We shouldn't be planning integrated communities. Nobody cares about this anymore. It's a post-racial world. At the same time, we're seeing movements in the courts to say that charter schools should be able to operate in segregated conditions, and that segregated schools are the best way to deal with the disparities. Should we be giving up this battle about racial integration? You have a lot of times people on the left and the housing movement and the community housing movement agree with President Trump. People in the charter school movement a lot of times do too. They just think that integration isn't important anymore. What about this? Should we care about this? Should we fight about this? Or should we let go?
To whom are you addressing the question?
Mr. Ellison, maybe.
Now, let me tell you, abandoning a society where we're affirmatively furthering fair housing means that we are moving back to segregation. In my mind, segregation is isolation. And if you can create isolated communities, then you can literally do whatever you want to the people in those isolated communities, and nobody even cares because nobody really knows them except for through the television screen. You can it doesn't matter what the police do over there. It doesn't matter whether there's no true law enforcement there to protect people from domestic violence, fraud, official misconduct. It doesn't matter because we don't care what they do to each other over there. I mean, these communities affirmatively furthering fair housing means that people can live where they want to live. It means that if you want to look, if you're Black and you want to live in the Black community, you live there. If you want to live in a community where you might be able to, I don't know, live in an integrated community, access a certain kind of store and a certain kind of job, then you can do that too. But look, we live in America. We got 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and about 50 plus years of anything else. What is that anything else? Well, that's redlining, that's denying, that's saying that people who are domestic workers or agricultural workers don't get the benefit of Social Security. That's all that. I mean, the bottom line is Black people are not so much in poverty as they are impoverished by the society that they live in. Affirmatively furthering fair housing means people can live, they can have a place to lay their head in safety and security and in good health. We know that if you want to close the test score gap between Black and white students, house those students well, you're gonna make a big dent in that right there. You wanna improve health outcomes for Black people? Make sure they're stably housed in this richest society of the world. And by the way, we're not talking about no charity right now, because you and I both know that if you stack up all of these subsidies that upper middle class homeowners get, they far dwarf the HUD budget in Washington, D.C. I was in Congress for 12 years. I can tell you the mortgage interest deduction alone is bigger than the HUD budget. So we ain't got no problem with giving money to upper middle class white people. We do it every day and all the time. We have a problem with making sure that the people who picked the cotton and hewed the wood that their grandkids and great grandkids have a shot at a good life. That's what offends us. That's what keeps members of Congress, like Mitch McConnell, up at night. The possibility that somebody who's been excluded might actually possibly one day be included. That's what upsets them. What I'm saying is we've got to fight for affirmatively further and fair housing. We've got to fight for everybody getting healthcare access. We've got to fight for liberty and justice for all and never abandon it.
I think it's also a way just to keep us powerless, to keep us set into a category where they don't know what we're doing. So they don't have to listen to us. So they don't have to pay attention to us, to pigeonhole us into different areas of the state where that's the ghetto. We don't pay attention to those. We don't need to know what's going on over there. And I think that's a way of just keeping everybody powerless and separated. And so we have to fight for all of this. We definitely have to fight for this to make sure that we have equal justice for all of us.
Our battle was not for integration, it was for desegregation. Our battle was to tear down a system of racist suppression, the pre-apartheid that existed in the United States. And as Attorney General Ellison said, there is no going back. One of the things, and unfortunately, I even hear this among some Black folks who are almost nostalgic for Jim Crow, talking about, we had our own stores and we had our own schools, and it's like, well, danger, Will Robinson. Let's stop for a second and look at what actually was happening. Were all of these things equal in terms of resources? No. Were we talking about the same quality? No. We might have been talking about the same intent, but that is completely different. So there's no room for nostalgia about Jim Crow. It was a heinous system. The apartheid folks looked at it. Hitler used it. I mean, there's no going back. And so I think we have to understand that Trump is once again playing to his base. His base is really caught up with this fear of white genocide and of white replacement. It's this whole notion that it doesn't pay to be white anymore. And that's what we just gotta be very direct about. This is very dangerous, and there can be no room for concessions to this kind of orientation.
Mr. Woodall, you have any thoughts?
Most definitely. And I think, when we allow the individuals and entities that in many ways are responsible directly for the oppression and dehumanization of our people to define the rules of engagement. And what I mean by that is they've tried to almost always, even today, today with election stuff and yesterday with conversations about rural suburbs and how Trump is trying to really put communities against one another. The fight is not against, for me at least, it is not against flesh and blood. So every time we define the fight by being elements of social construction, meaning race, which though is very real, is a social construction. And so I think every time we fight that fight, we fight a losing fight, because the fight is not against the flesh and blood, but rather it's against power. It's against systems of domination and oppression that are committed to regard, because the reality is there are just as many people who are not Black, who are just being oppressed and dehumanized and killed and murdered. But only thing we're talking about today is how do we make Black people better in position to create the kind of systematic change that is necessary. I'm all for that conversation. But what I don't want us to do is limit ourselves. If we're going to have a conversation about liberation, it has to be about liberation for all people. Because for me, Blackness is not an identity of who I am, but rather it's an element of how we became to be in this world. Because when I was created and God blew breath into the dirt, it was not a Black body, it was a living soul. And so for me, we have to be able to define the rules of engagement for ourselves. Because if we do not, I am afraid we will lose. Because again, this is not a new question. This is not a new issue. We've been fighting this fight, at least in this country, for nearly 400 years. But yet somehow, some way, we still have more people being murdered, still got people in isolation and in institutions of enslavement called prisons. We still have people who are in poverty. We still have people who are not able to have access to healthcare. And so for me, I'm like, what are we doing wrong? Or what can we do that's differently than what we've done before so that we can actually get to a place of parity, of equity, and of liberation? Because for me, it's not about preservation of Blackness. I'm just gonna be honest. It's not about preservation of Blackness. It's about the preservation of humanity, because that includes all people. And so I just want to really lift that up, because when we have conversations, and I'm very pro-Black, let's not conflate that at all. I love my Black people. I love my Black skin. But when we're talking about liberation, for me, liberation cannot equate to the preservation of Blackness, because Blackness without whiteness is nothing.
Thank you very much.
And so I encourage people to look in Victor Anderson's Ontological Blackness, to really challenge us to understand what Blackness is as a concept, as a construction, because without that, we're just having conversations about constructions that we did not create. And I'm very, very intentional about doing that.
What do some of the panelists, some of the questions have said, how do we begin to work together? How should we pick priorities? Where do we engage? Where do labor leaders, which many of you are, and civil rights leaders, which you all are, how do we begin to build a multiracial coalition? And how do we begin to build solidarity among labor and African Americans and Latinos and whites? And where do we start? Go ahead, Mr. Woodall.
I start with, it's a two-part answer for me. One is as organically as possible. Oftentimes when we talk about multiracial coalitions and diverse coalitions, people are always trying to really appease certain sects of community. Be yourself. Come to the table with your full, authentic self, and don't be afraid to actually challenge systems and institutions at the heart. What we've experienced, especially here in Georgia, and specifically Atlanta, we've experienced people who are committed to acts of symbolic solidarity, but we're not actually committed to destroying and deconstructing racist institutions. And so if you are committed to the work of equity and truly liberation for all people, you have to be yourself. You have to be willing to challenge systems that sometimes you may even benefit from. We are literally done dying. And so what that means is every single element of racist implication, from statute to statutes to public policy to institutions, banks, schools, higher education, jobs, corporate, all down the line. You have to be committed all the way or none at all. And so it takes a little courage. It takes some good necessary trouble. But if you are committed to building that coalition, I guarantee you, one, you have to be yourself. You have to be authentic and organic, but most of all, you have to be committed to truly liberation, true liberation for all people.
You know what? I want to agree with you there. And that was part of my first statement when I talked about staying true to yourself and not apologizing. The only approval you need is your conscience and God's. And you have to enter a room, even though people are not going to like it all the time, but you have to speak up and you have to speak directly to what the problem is. And we can no longer be shy and timid and not be able to take on the fights that will help progress the African-American people, but all people. and women must do it more effectively than anyone. We are the growing population in the African American population that is voting more. In 2018, we 6% of the highest rate of turnout and voting, and our issues are not being addressed. And when I look at my race and gaining power and talking about multicultural areas, the new millenniums and the Gen X are talking about issues. They're not so much about Democrat and Republican. They're talking about police brutality. They're talking about economic justice. They're talking about things around those areas that are dear to our hearts. But also in the community of multicultural race, they are listening and they actually get it too. So with the baby boomers, it's getting to be less of us and more of the new norm of speaking out and protesting. And we have to learn how to speak to the issue of the people of America and not just look at them and think that we don't know what's going on or we don't have intelligence enough to know what's going on. We have to be direct, we have to be focused, and we have to be demanding in what our ask is. So I agree with that.
I think I just want to add.
Yeah, go right ahead.
No,
go ahead,
please, go
Bill.
ahead.
No, I'm listening to you.
Thank you. Real quick. To build multiracial coalitions, a critical mass of white working people are going to have to understand that it's in their interests to oppose racism. That this is not a moral question or moralistic question. This is a matter of self-interest. That to the extent that you have a system of racist oppression that continues, it disadvantages and undermines the ability of white working people to advance. We see this time and again. You look at differentials in terms of income in areas where racial discrimination has been the strongest, and white workers end up being lower than in places where there's higher levels of unionization and a greater social benefits. So to the extent that white workers continue to identify with the rich and the infamous, as opposed to with people that may not look like them, but are suffering not too differently from them, they will be subjugated. We won't have the kind of multiracial movement that we need. And so that's one of the central things that I would argue and have been arguing that the labor movement needs to take on. It's not about asking white people to feel sorry for us. It's about telling them, look in the damn mirror and understand what the system is doing to you.
So I think Bill is spot on. Let me build on that just a little bit. So look, our problem is that because of white supremacy, white people falsely believe that they are not allowed to have problems and so they don't speak about their own problems. But if you look at this study from a few years ago out of Princeton, white men over 50, non-college, have the worst morbidity and mortality numbers in the country. They are killing each other with handgun suicides. That they are. They're killing each other. They're killing themselves. They are dying from cirrhosis. They're dying from opioid addiction. And every time you loosen gun laws, white male suicide goes up. Have you ever seen it on the news? No. Now, if you want to talk about Black dysfunction, oh, everybody wants to talk about that. Why are those Black folks killing each other? Why do we have Black on Black crime? When are the Black people going to stop being so crazy and messed up? Well, wait a minute. I think it's kind of something that white folks do to go into a school and shoot up everybody, right? I think it's kind of a thing. Why? I mean, this means sex crimes. A lot of white male dysfunction in that area. What I'm saying is that white supremacy prohibits us as a society from dealing with the problems of white people. Therefore, we don't ask ourselves, why do white male adolescents feel they need a gun to go shoot up the school? Why do white men over 50 who are not college have this problem with suicide? Why do we have why do we have so many problems? You know, why are so many of the police that end up shooting and killing people? Why are they so often white? The problem is this is a sociological, economic, psychological, medical issue that we don't address because we will not allow ourselves to entertain the idea that white people have problems too. I mean, here's the reality. There's a great book I would commend to anyone. It's called Dying of Whiteness. If you're a reader, write the name of this book down, Dying of Whiteness. It's about 3 case studies. One is if you compare Kentucky and Tennessee, Kentucky extended Medicaid expansion, Tennessee didn't. Why didn't Tennessee extend it? Well, they said, I don't want to have my taxes go to some welfare queen getting free health care. Race-based arguments to not extend Medicaid. Kentucky, they did it. The health outcomes between Kentucky and Tennessee are stark and growing ever since Obamacare came into effect. You look at Missouri. Anybody can get a gun, you can carry it anywhere you want. White male suicide goes up, nobody even talks about it. Our fellow Americans are in a crisis when it comes to suicide by the hands of a gun at their own hand, and nobody is even stopping to say, well, let's do something about this. I mean, and if you take another case of just the whole administrative state, what does it mean to cut taxes? If you cut taxes, you might end up like Kansas, where they had to get rid of a whole school day. You think it's only black kids that missed a school day? Whole lot of white kids missed a school day. Same thing happened in Oklahoma. Whole lot of school day went from 5 days down to 4. You think it's only black kids who got hurt? My point is, as organizers, we don't identify the problems that people are having and then engage them in a solution around their own problems. We allow the problems that are being experienced, yes, more by black people and brown people, but also being experienced by all working class people. And we don't say, look, let's organize around this problem. We say, we allow the racialized myth. This issue of COVID, absolutely black people are hit harder. A lot of white people getting COVID though, right? So what do? We allow the narrative that this is a black disease or an old person disease, which allows these bunch of idiots in Southern, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, to act like, oh, you know, young white people are not at risk. They're dying in Florida hand over fist because of this man's absolute negligence and recklessness. But because we allow it to be a racialized argument, white people think, well, this doesn't apply to me, even those people are dying to their left and to their right. Their grandparents are dying, their kids are dying, people around them are dying and getting sick, but we've allowed this to be racialized. My thing is we've got to organize beyond our comfort zone. You got to organize beyond your comfort zone. Look, I'm the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. If Minnesota has more than 5% black people, I would be shocked. How did I get elected? Because I'm black and I'm proud. Everybody knows that. But I don't let my circle of compassion be limited only to people who got my skin tone. We're talking about everybody. Everybody needs clean water. Everybody needs clean air. You know what? We commissioned, sorry for going on so long, I'm gonna stop right here. We commissioned, as Attorney General, first black Attorney General, we said we're gonna study and have a task force on reducing deadly force encounters with police. You follow what I'm saying? We did a study on police brutality last year, 2019, before George Floyd. We found that a majority of the officer-involved killings were white people in greater Minnesota. Most of the people who are excluded from voting because they have a felony are white. Now, these issues are racialized, and yet they affect everybody. The real difference is that black people know they're oppressed, accept the fact that they're oppressed, and therefore don't mind going to protest the fact that they're oppressed. Whereas if you're white, from what I've gathered, there's a degree of shame associated with being a victim of police brutality or having a felony. Whereas black people say, I got a felony because I'm in an oppressive situation. White people say, oh, I'm such a loser, and they don't want to talk about it. What if we had a movement that said, you know what, everybody who has a felony and can't vote, we're for you. And we reached out to all of them, all. We know in Florida, Amendment 4 actually going to help a lot of white folks. Am I right about that? Absolutely, I am right about that. But they don't speak up because of the shame associated. So let's be better organizers, and we can build a multiracial movement and have Black empowerment.
I got a question about the suburbs. You know, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of the panel is that more than half of non-white Americans, more than half of Black and Latino and Asian families live in the suburbs. And particularly if you look at Black and Latino families at or above the median, about 2/3 live in the suburbs. These are places, these racially diverse suburbs have twice the population as majority white suburbs. Do they present an opportunity when we're organizing and getting out the vote? Should we be thinking more about the suburbs? Should we be, in some of the parts of the country, these racially diverse suburbs are Democrat. In some parts of these country, these racially diverse suburbs are conservative or Republican. Should people be thinking about these suburbs as important places in the country? Are civil rights organizations and labor unions, are they engaged in the diversity that exists in America? Anybody like to take that one on? Mr. Woodall.
Definitely. I would argue that the most important, I guess, geographic area within the electoral space is not the suburbs, is not the metropolitan, but rather it's the rural communities. Here in Georgia, we're experiencing unprecedented rates of migration, if you will, closer to the metro communities, so suburbs, yes. But what I've experienced, at least in my organizing, is that one of the greatest spaces of political power, of economic power, of social power, of theological power, even military power is outside of the metropolitan communities. And so every time we've seen an engagement on these issues, almost always they tend to start in Atlanta. They tend to start on the outskirts of Atlanta. But I've seen the success, at least in my research, in my scholarship, as well as in my activism and organizing, is that if you leave that kind of perimeter, if you will, you actually go to the smaller towns where, you know, houses are 2-3 miles away apart from each other, where you have horrible reception, no broadband access, hospitals are 50 miles away, that is where the people actually are. The people who are able to go out into the streets and get things done, the people who are able to call 20, 30, 40 people and build a network so that you can be able to push policies that you're trying to get done. That is where the power actually is. And so I suggest that we reframe how we include those people, because I believe we do have power already. It's just we are not utilizing it correctly as a collective. And so I argue that, you know, the suburbs, yes, but that's an old narrative. I would suggest that we actually look at the rural communities and really build from there.
Well, I'm getting a warning that we're over our time and we need to wrap it up. But I'd like to thank this panel for a very enriching discussion about the possibilities of multiracial political power and Black leadership. As we've started the panel saying, there's a tremendous diversity in American suburbs, and there lies therein a possibility to build a progressive leadership, not only in the central cities, but in the suburbs, and as Mr. Woodall says, in the rural areas of the country as well. I think as we go through the rest of the discussion, we'll be thinking about legislatures and Congress and how, in a nonpartisan way, a more progressive political agenda that enhances civil rights and labor rights can move together. We've got a lot of discussion ongoing. We've got a lot of important panels. So I want to wrap this panel up, and we'll be moving after a break to our next panel that you have in the links before you. Thank you, all the panelists, and thank you, audience, for your good questions and your patience with our difficulties in technical proficiency. We'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder to everyone who's watching us, there is a different link for the next panel that starts at 4:15. Enjoy yourselves and have a great day. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you, Professor Orfield.
Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you for all the good work that all the people that have supported this conference have undertaken.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep, thank you.
Great job, everybody, man.
Thank you so much.
Great panel. You hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Racially Divided Society, featuring Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Richard Rothstein, Tiffany Flores, Dr. Stella Flores, and Cheryl Cashin. My name is Stefan Lallinger, and I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation, progressive think tank with a decades-long track record of studying the issue of racial and socioeconomic school integration in America, and the director of the Bridges Collaborative, a new national initiative for practitioners that focuses on school integration. This issue is intensely personal for me. My grandfather, Lewis L. Redding, was a lawyer from Delaware and the only Black graduate in his class of the Harvard Law School class of 1928. In 1954, he, alongside Thurgood Marshall and others, won the most celebrated court case in American history, Brown versus the Board of Education. And yet here we are, 6.5 decades later, living in a country where we don't bat an eye at the sight of segregated schools, segregated housing, and rampant discrimination based on race, class, or other identities. The purpose of this conversation today is to lay bare the devastating results and ongoing impact of our unwillingness to challenge racial segregation in our schools, our neighborhoods, our regions, and in the area of employment. We want to ask ourselves, what are the implications for a society that lives under these conditions? I can think of no more fitting conversation to have on the day our nation celebrates the homegoing of the legendary John Lewis, a humble man from Troy, Alabama, who spent his entire life and career fighting for these issues. The agenda for our next hour and 10 minutes. First, we'll begin with some opening remarks from the esteemed Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Then I'll introduce the panel, and we'll spend the last hour engaging in a dialogue with all of our panelists. Here to introduce our featured speaker is the former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and current professor of law and director for the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina, Professor Ted Shaw.
Thank you. I hope I'm unmuted, am I? Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor Shaw, you can,
okay.
We can hear you. You
All
can
right.
continue.
Good,
Thank you.
good. Thank you. And Stefan, let me say, I wish I had a chance to see you in person. As a young lawyer, which means a long, long time ago, at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I did meet your father and did a little work with him. He was a cooperating attorney, as you know, for the Legal Defense Fund. So it's good to see you. They say that apples don't fall far from trees. I say they do roll sometimes, but apparently you haven't done much rolling. Glad to see you. I have the honor of introducing a dear and longtime friend, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. And we, in full disclosure, we went to college together. So, I have other friends on this panel, Richard Rothstein, and also Cheryl Cash and Tiffany and Stella. Good to see you all too. But Beverly Daniel Tatum and I, as I say, go way back. I remember in college, I said this to her a few weeks ago, we would sit in the cafeteria, and there would in fact be tables where Black students sat. And I remember somebody coming over one time, more than once, and saying, why are all the Black children, or students rather, at the same table? And I remember saying one time, well, why are all these tables full of white folk? Even then, I'm sure that Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum had her eye on this issue and was conscious. And there was always something very thoughtful about her, very deliberate and careful in addressing issues of race. So I can't say I was terribly surprised when she eventually wrote her book by that title. And then, as I hope you all know, she had an anniversary edition come out, was it last year or the year before that? But I have it on the shelf here in my study. This book has had a tremendous impact, as has she. And then, of course, being president of Spelman College, those of us who knew her and know her are proud of her for all kinds of reasons. But she's made an impact and is continuing to make an impact on our country. And she's one of the thought leaders when it comes to issues of race. And so we're very fortunate and grateful that she could spend some time with us today. I could go on and on about her, but I've already overstayed my welcome. I just want to say I introduce Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, friend, colleague, and one of our nation's thought leaders. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you, Ted. And I just want to say you took me back to Wesleyan University with your remarks. I appreciate being here and having that invitation. And certainly all of our Wesleyan friends are proud of you and the work that you've done all these years. So thank you for that warm introduction. And I'm very pleased and excited to be part of such a distinguished panel to talk about two Americas and what we might call American apartheid. It is remarkable in some ways that we are having this conversation 52 years after the release of the Kerner Commission report, and also 52 years after the publication of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King's book, his last book, titled Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And I want to reference that book in the opening of my remarks because I think we are at a moment in our society where that is the choice facing us, chaos or community. And how do we think about that with the current polarization that we're experiencing in our society? I want to start by providing a little context for that question by talking about the demographics of our society. I was born in 1954. We see that as a landmark date, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. But in 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everybody else. Not just 10% Black, 10% Black, Latinx, Asian, all of us, people of color together in an overwhelmingly white, 90% white nation. Fast forward to 2020, if you are under the age of 18 today, you are part of a population cohort that is only 52% white, 48% everybody else. We know that the Latinx population today is the largest population of color, approximately 18%. The Black population, approximately 13%. The Asian American population, 6%. Small, relatively speaking, to the others, but among the fastest growing population. And of course, we now count people in terms of their multiracial identity as well. In the 70s, that was just 1% of our population, but today, roughly 10% of babies born today are categorized as multiracial. So we have a society that has rapidly changed in its demographics, and we might talk about the fact that that rapid change is part of what is fueling the polarization in our society, because certainly it is causing a paradigm shift for white Americans to think about their nation not as a white majority nation, but a nation in which white people are a part of a pluralistic society. That is a shift. When we hear people talking about making America great again, using that Trump slogan, sometimes it gets translated into making America white again, which of course what perhaps a better description of how it was when Donald Trump was coming of age in the 50s. So we have this changing population, but as I like to say, new faces, same places. Despite the fact that the population is much more diverse, the school-age population is still highly segregated. Old patterns of segregation persist, most notably in schools and neighborhoods. More than 60 years after that Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, American schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980, as measured by the percentage of Black students who are attending schools that are 90 to 100% non-white, as they're referenced by the Department of Education. Nationwide, nearly 75% of Black students today attend so-called majority minority schools. Similarly, approximately 80% of Latinx students attend schools where students of color are in the majority. Both Black and Latinx students are much more likely than white students to attend a school where 60% or more of their classmates are living in poverty. Separate remains unequal, as schools with concentrated poverty and racial segregation are still likely to have less experienced teachers, high levels of teacher turnover, inadequate facilities, and fewer classroom resources. Many people will ask me, well, why is that? Why is it that, 60 plus years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we've made such little progress? Those of you who know the legal history will know that there were key Supreme Court decisions between 1974 and 2007 that dramatically reduced the number of implementation methods available to communities engaged in school desegregation by eliminating strategies such as cross-district busing, dismantling local court supervision of desegregation plans, and limiting use of race-based admissions to ensure diversity in magnet school programs, for example. As these options for desegregation have been curtailed by court rulings, the number of intensely segregated schools with 0 to 10% white enrollment has more than tripled. Once again, students are typically assigned to schools based on their residence, where they live. And to the extent that neighborhoods are segregated, the schools remain so. Consequently, in 2020, young people growing up in racially divided communities are almost as separated from each other's daily lives as they were 52 years ago. According to a 2013 American Values Survey, which was conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, the social networks of white people in the United States are very homogeneous. Indeed, the researchers found that 75% of white adults have entirely white social networks without any presence of people of color, meaning not in their neighborhoods, not in their schools, not at their workplaces. The consequence of that is that most white adults are not socially positioned to understand or even have accurate information about the experiences of people of color because they are not part of their social networks. We know that a lot of things have changed over the last 20 years since the first version of my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, came out in 1997, the new edition coming out in 2017. But one of the factors I want to mention in this current context is the dramatic rise in incarceration rates over the last 20 years, particularly for Black men. Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, has described the social impact of this new reality. And I want to mention it in the context of this discussion of American apartheid because, too, it also speaks to another way Black people have been isolated. More Black men are in prison today, according to Michelle Alexander's commentary, than at any other moment in our nation's history. She writes, more are disenfranchised today than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Young Black men today are maybe just as likely to suffer discrimination in employment, housing, public benefits, and jury service as a Black man in the Jim Crow era. Discrimination that is perfectly legal because it's based on one's criminal record. This, she writes, is the new normal, the new racial equilibrium. The criminalization of the Black population contributes to what I am going to call, for the purpose of our conversation, the empathy gap. because in the minds of many people, criminals do not deserve empathy. Dr. King, in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, talked about the fact that this empathy gap was at the heart of our inability to move toward a truly integrated society. He said laws can change, but until people really identify with the experience, until white people really identify with the experience of Black people, nothing substantive will be changed on a permanent basis. Because after every period of progress, there's pushback against progress. He describes that pushback in 1968. We can feel that pushback today in 2020. In order to push forward again, he says we have to bridge that empathy gap, which will come as a result of meaningful racial contact. Now, I want to just say one thing about that empathy gap, and then I will pause so that others will have a chance to be part of this conversation. But if we fast forward to the events of the last few weeks since the killing of George Floyd, what one might say is that we have experienced as a nation a moment of empathy. What do I mean by that? People are at home because of COVID-19, watching the news on their screens, seeing that horrible video of that man's murder, that Black man's murder by that police officer. And the anger and distress that many people have expressed, not just Black people, but white people, Latinx people, Asian people, a multiracial coalition of folks expressing distress and anger, rage about that, speaks to me a kind of empathy, a kind of recognition of his humanity being snuffed out in a way that we don't always see, and a kind of empathy that we didn't see in Ferguson, a kind of empathy that we didn't see in response to the Trayvon Martin killing, a kind of empathy that perhaps because we had to focus for that long period of time with such a clear shot of that murder happening in real time, awakened a kind of understanding that some people are really being mistreated by systems of oppression, that white supremacy is a real thing and really impacting in a way that when we talk about the numbers of school districts that are highly segregated or neighborhoods that persist in segregation have not created the same kind of awareness or empathy. I'm a psychologist. I think about things like empathy, but I think if we are to take advantage of this moment, we have to come back to the question of how we push forward. Do we choose chaos or community? Because the kind of two Americas we have at the moment is leading us down the road toward chaos unless we make a different choice. With that, I'm going to stop, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the program.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tatum, for sharing those powerful words and for helping us to really frame the issue at hand and what we're talking about today. And really thank you for bringing it to the present. We will certainly be spending a good portion of this conversation talking about what the implications of the events of the last few months on this particular issue are. So thank you so very much. And we'll be sure to make sure you are a large part of this conversation that we now turn to. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are available on the screen, but very briefly, we've got with us today Richard Rothstein, who is the author of The Color of Law and a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. We've got Tiffany Torres, an operations leader at Teens Take Charge, which is a youth advocacy group in New York City, and she's also a rising college freshman at Georgetown University. Cheryl Cashin is the author of Place Not Race and a professor of law, civil rights, and social justice at Georgetown University. And Dr. Stella Flores is the Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Diversity and an Associate Professor of Higher Education at NYU. I'm so excited to have such a tremendous and high-powered panel. In my experience, panels work best when we keep our answers concise and to the point so that we can bring in a wide diversity of opinions that we have on this stellar panel. And so to that end, my role will be to keep us moving. And so while acknowledging that that might appear a little awkward since we're all virtual, I'm thanking all of the panelists in advance to for agreeing to share their airtime. Mr. Rothstein, I'm going to actually turn to you and start with you, sir. Many people today see segregation as a choice. They say birds of a feather just flock together, and whites just want to live among whites, and blacks have chosen to stay in urban areas or move to nearly all black neighborhoods and send their kids to all black and brown schools. So, we've heard about redlining in the past. Why is the segregation that we're seeing today not just an expression of the freedom of the choices that people have? And if it's not, what's wrong with people choosing to live amongst themselves anyway? Can you shed some light on that question, please?
Sure, Stefan, thank you. We have a widespread national myth. It's a rationalization we give ourselves. It's shared by blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners. The myth is that we have something we call de facto segregation. I use the term, I think many of us have used that term when we look at the patterns in every metropolitan area of the country. A de facto segregation is segregation that was created not just by people wanting to live with each other of the same race, as you said, but many people acknowledge that there was discrimination. They think it was all private. It was bigoted landlords or homeowners refusing to sell or rent to African Americans, or actors in the private economy like real estate agents or banks discriminating, or income differences. All of these individual personal decisions, bigoted, but nonetheless not governmental, is what created segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. Most of us think it's too bad to live in such a segregated society, but we don't feel any obligation to do anything about it. This is a very destructive myth, because if we understood the reality that the residential segregation in every metropolitan area was created by government policy and regulation, explicitly racial in intent, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. If we understood that history, we would have understood that the segregation that was imposed on this country was a constitutional violation. The federal government was doing it. It was a Fifth Amendment violation. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation. And if these are civil rights violations, every one of us as American citizens has an obligation to remedy it. So the myth is very, very destructive. It relieves us of responsibility to take action that we would have to assume as American citizens if we understood the unconstitutional nature of segregation. I don't have a lot of time right now to explain all the many policies the federal government followed. I'll just mention one, perhaps the most powerful, and that is in the post-World War II period. The federal government embarked on a program explicitly racial to move the white working class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs surrounding central cities in every metropolitan area of the country. We're all familiar with many of these suburbs. In every community in the country, they exist. The developers of these suburbs could never have assembled the capital to build as many as, in the case of Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. Westlake, south of San Francisco, 15,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to buy the land and build those kinds of homes? The only way those suburbs could have been developed was when Levitt and the other builders went to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, requested federal bank guarantees for their loans to buy the land and build the developments. And the federal agencies gave them those bank guarantees on condition that they sold no homes to African Americans. The FHA even required that they place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was a written policy in the federal underwriting manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend for federal bank guarantees. The applications of developers, the manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that would sell homes to African Americans. It went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white development that was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. I mean, this de facto notion is utter nonsense. It has no basis in reality whatsoever. Of course, there was private bigotry. Levitt was a bigot. If left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold homes to African Americans, but he wasn't left to his own devices. If the federal government had agreed to give him a bank guarantee on condition that he sell homes without discrimination, he would have had to do it. So the fact that there was private bigotry is not the explanation for our residential segregation. And let me say that this suburbanization policy, which is one of many, many policies that federal, state, and local governments followed to create segregation, the suburbanization policy is primarily responsible for the enormous wealth gap that exists today between African Americans and whites. African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that related to Jim Crow policies. But you'd think that people with 60% of the incomes of whites would be able to save and have wealth that's 60% of the wealth of whites. But in reality, although African Americans have incomes on average that are about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth.
And actually, the wealth gap is something that we're absolutely going to get into here in a minute. And so I really appreciate the framing, Mr. Rothstein. And I do want to say for our viewers, for those of you who have not read Mr. Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, he really lays out the case that he's making here in such a clear fashion about the ways in which the government at all levels has been complicit in creating the segregated society that we have today. So absolutely a must read for those who haven't read it. And Mr. Rothstein, we're going to get back to you in a second on some of those issues you brought up. Some of them are very pertinent to today. I'm going to turn for a moment to Tiffany Torres, who is with us from New York City. She's an activist with Teens Take Charge, which is really a tremendous group in New York City. They carry a really loud voice. I can tell you, I worked at the New York City Department of Education, and we were always interested in what Teens Take Charge was up to and what they were saying. So when they speak, people listen. And Tiffany has been a big part of that. So Tiffany, you recently graduated from high school. Congratulations. And in addition to your studies, you've been, among other things, chasing Mayor de Blasio around the city and demanding that he integrate New York City. So you can tell us a funny anecdote or two about that if you care. But first, talk to us a little bit about how you even got involved in this issue. Why is fighting segregation important to you and all of the other young people in New York City that you work with so closely?
Thank you for the introduction. I first heard of Teens Take Charge when I was in my junior year of high school, the beginning of my junior year. And I'm in this program called SEO Scholars, where the tagline is that they help get low-income students to and through college. So from the beginning or middle of my freshman year, we've been taking extra classes on Saturdays after school and during the summer. So over, I think, 720 hours by the end of our high school career, we'll have taken supplemental classes in English and math. And their whole purpose is to bridge the achievement and opportunity gap with students that go to majority low-income, majority students of color schools to more affluent students. And that was kind of like my first introduction to understanding this world of inequity and the inequality that exists in my education, because I come from an immigrant family. My parents came here in the 70s from the Dominican Republic, and I have always, they've always instilled in me the value of education, but I never understood that the education that I was receiving wasn't equal to my counterparts. I've always heard that whatever you do is on you, and it's up to you to make sure that the education that you're receiving is up to par, when in reality, that's not the truth, especially in New York City. And so it was one day during SEO where I heard about Teens Take Charge. I immediately joined. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And it's definitely been a journey, especially with Mr. de Blasio. Our first conversation was a lot nicer than our second conversation, which is on our website, if you guys want to listen to that, but I don't really want to get into it right now. Yeah, so I guess a little bit of—
Well, hold on. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. Can you tell us really quickly, because I was in New York when this happened, can you tell us just very briefly about calling into the radio show? I think folks would be interested in that.
Yeah, so I didn't think that they were going to put me through. I actually, like, before you get connected onto the show, you like speak to someone that's like screening all of the calls. And I had written a script right beforehand because I was nervous going in without a script. So I made sure that I had one. And I started to read it to the person that was screening the calls because I didn't realize that that was a process. And the whole thing was just confusing. But I remember like when I actually got onto the call, once I started, I couldn't necessarily stop. Like I felt so driven by all of the experiences that I had and also all of the experiences of the students around me. And my school staff was, for the most part, really supportive. I remember I did not go to my math class that period. And I told my professor, like, I'm gonna call into the show, I can't come to class. And then I like ran away before he could tell me that I couldn't do that. And it was an interesting call. I think the second one, he was very frustrated, which was obvious. When he said, I really think you're not listening to me or to us. And that was like the moment where I realized that the fight was never going to stop, especially if he was so frustrated by the work that we had been doing for just a few months.
So you all hear when I say when Teens Take Charge talks, people listen. They find ways of making sure their voices are heard. Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. We'll be sure to come back to you on a couple of these issues. I want to turn to Dean Flores. Dean, you've also written about segregation among Black and Latinx children and its impact particularly on educational outcomes in college. What have you learned about the effects of segregation, not only on what some people call the education achievement gap, but on life outcomes in general, including things like college participation rates and attainment, earnings, wealth, and health? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to be with this distinguished panel. So I set this up as as if I was, what are the three things I'd like to tell folks about the effects of segregation based on my research and the research of others. And so I'm gonna call your attention to three themes in terms of what I think are some of the effects and consequences of racial segregation. And the first is the broken and unacknowledged chain of evidence on segregation from kindergarten to post-secondary education. I feel like there's this denial of evidence across the pipeline. We have evidence that in the early grades, there's definitely negative effects on achievement, on test scores, on the school experience when there's racial segregation. And I feel like the public accepts that to some extent. But as we move up the chain, there's this sudden denial that the role of race was ever part of our K through 12 system. And so what the break in the chain is what I call the magical land of race neutral higher education policy, in particular for financial aid. It's completely race neutral. We don't consider the role of racial inequality. We don't consider the history of how the government has, various government policies has deliberately segregated opportunities by race. And so then we come to this college land where apparently race is not supposed to matter. And then we jump into, for example, a place where race might be acknowledged in terms of our minority serving institutions. So you get some sense of, yes, we have HBCUs, we have Hispanic serving institutions, we have tribal colleges and universities, but there's no extra funding in terms of acknowledging all of the basically burdens and history that these institutions have to take on. Some are well-resourced and are doing amazing, and others are doing amazing with very little resources. And my research shows, mine and my colleagues, that in fact the college completion rate is the same at HBCUs and HSIs in Texas, for example, as similar institutions. But all we hear is a negative, on average, a negative perception of these institutions when they're actually doing a lot better for the resources that they have. And to that extent, then the third point I want to bring up has to do, I'm sorry, I'm on the second part is that we're a nation of constrained progress. So related to that, we have students that are doing well with very little resources, and we celebrate that instead of being deeply angry that we've cut off their human capital. How many students have we not allowed to do better? right? We should be angry that we have not given enough resources and we've basically cut off opportunity. So we need to flip that around instead of saying, oh, look at the grit that these students are showing, they're doing so well, instead of saying, how have we damaged the opportunities of these students? Students should not have to be superheroes because they're minorities. We're thinking about this in the wrong way. The other point I want to mention is that we've become a culture of funneling up disadvantage from early childhood to the labor market. We begin with segregation early in childhood, and then we move into high school. Then we move into college, where the colleges are segregated. You have more white students as a proportion of population in selective institutions than there are really white students to go around. There are more minority students as a share of population in non-selective institutions than there are minority students to go around. So it's a complete imbalance. Segregation is literally traveling from early childhood to post-secondary education. And it's also in the labor market, which I'll finish up with. So here's the story. If we think about racial segregation, it's not just in one sector. It's in schools, it's in colleges, it's in the banking system, it's tied to wealth. And if I were to name 3 mechanisms that I think are tied to racial segregation in education, the first one is home ownership. Mortgages and home ownership. Parents who can help their kids buy a home or help their kids inherit a home are going to inherit more wealth and be more likely to be better off. College tuition. Parents who can pay for college or other supplementary schooling for college are going to have children that are better well off. Parents who have high enough incomes that are reflected in their kids' test scores are actually going to receive more state and federal scholarships, even though they don't need it in terms of need. Our need-based aid has gone down, and we're giving more money to students with higher test scores, and we know who those students are. Finally, networking in the labor market. A surprising number, this is a study out of the Federal Reserve Bank, of white males got their jobs from their white male fathers into white collar labor market areas. So between mortgages, college tuition, and networking in the labor market, we're basically recycling racial segregation. And what I want to bring out about that is that racial segregation is just not about housing and schools, it's in all these other sectors. And when we do one sector policies, we're really, we're not moving forward. It's not gonna make a dent in reducing racial inequality. And until we attack all these policies at once and come to terms with not only cumulative disadvantage, but cumulative advantage, and the effects of advantages across generation, and what that has done for people who have necessarily not earned it, and what that has done for individuals who never had a chance to even get there. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. You've given us a lot to think about. And Professor Cashin, I'm going to come to you, not specifically on that topic, although I'll come back to you on that topic. I know you have a lot of thoughts on higher education and selective admissions in particular, so we'll come back to that. I wanted to start with you about the fact that many people today talk about combating institutional or systemic racism and the need for things like reparations to compensate for slavery and Jim Crow. You have said we also need to look at things that exist today in terms of the policies, the structures, and the systems that oppress people. Can you talk about, just sort of elucidate for us, talk about what those systems are that you talk about, and why you've called, this is, I think people will find it interesting, why you've called the people who are living under segregation today the, quote, true descendants of slavery. So maybe shed light on the question first, and then you can tell us what you mean when you use that those terms.
I'll be frank. I'm working on a book that'll come out next year, in which I'm emphasizing that. I so appreciate your work. Your work, Richard, makes my work easier. And what I'm kind of saying in this book is that the past is not past, right? That we constructed segregation, but state policy today, at all levels, government is basically investing in maintaining and reifying segregation, right? In fact, Trump makes this transparent. There's a silver lining. I mean, his tweet yesterday was a pro-segregation argument. Most of his public policies coming out of HUD support separate communities. All right, so my argument is that concentrated Black poverty, the iconic Black ghetto, is an intentional institution. The flip side of that is affluent white space. Both the public policies Richard talked about constructed both, and we've reified both. And there's serious distributional consequences today. And these institutions were animated by white supremacy. And so what I say is we tend to, there are 3 or 4 processes that are going on today. We have a caste system that's tied to geography. We overinvest in affluent white space, disinvest in poor Black space, and we tell lies about and mythologize the descendants. I call it the people trapped in iconic poor Black neighborhoods are the true descendants of slavery, to my mind. We tell lies and mythologize about the people in those neighborhoods to justify the way things are and mask the fact that there's a vacuum going on of, affluent white space, and the people who live there are getting way more than their fair share of public and private treasure, right? And again, the silver lining with Trump is he makes these things transparent. Just to emphasize that these processes are today, not the past. You look at every Black neighborhood that was redlined 80 years ago. Fully 3/4 of them are continuing to suffer to this day. There was a report from the Center for Investigative Reporting recently that said redlining persists, that is disinvestment, persists in 61 metro areas from Detroit, Philadelphia, Little Rock. And look at every dimension of public spending, particularly in schools. I can show you over-investing in white space, disinvesting in Black and brown space. And then the other thing that's very insidious is this dog whistling and the mythology about Black people, the stereotyping about Black people, with politicians for 50 years have been engaged in, and Trump is kind of revitalizing this rhetoric. All non-descendants participate in this stereotyping, right? Dr. Tatum talked about this. Part of the lack of empathy is, a lot of people believe these lies and participate in them. And that has a lot to do with why we can't seem to desegregate our neighborhoods or desegregate our schools. And the architecture of segregation, finally, the same people who are participating in this othering, they're being conscripted into the policing of Black bodies. So the stereotyping of Black people also leads to these awful situations like Amy Cooper calling the police on a Black birder, right? And the final thing I'll say is this segregation also facilitates a very different type of, what the state does is they disinvest in Black neighborhoods except when it comes to policing and incarceration, right? And so my argument, reparations has been, people are talking about that now. My argument is that reparation or repair must disrupt these processes, right? We have to repair what supremacy still breaks. And I am arguing that repair should begin in these iconic, poor Black neighborhoods. This book is for frankly, the children of the inner city, right? Not that I'm not very empathetic about how brown and Latinx people are also treated in our other groups, but repair needs to begin there. And in the Q&A, if I can get into more about what I think repair would look like.
Great, thank you so much. So now I'm excited to do a little bit more rapid fire questioning here. And what I want to do is I want to actually take something, Mr. Rothstein, that you said, and I want to pose a question to both Mr. Rothstein and to Dr. Tatum, and others can jump in afterward if they want as well. So, Mr. Rothstein, you said very specifically in your opening statements that we don't feel any obligation to do anything about the segregated system that we live in, we as Americans. I want to take it because both you and Dr. Tatum have talked about the systemic level and the systemic nature of this problem. And I want to bring it to the level of the individual. And I want to take Dr. Tatum's exhortation at the beginning to say, let's orient ourselves towards action. So my question is very simply this: what does the ordinary American, what can they do about this issue? How should they be thinking about their role in this bigger problem that we have identified here? So Dr. Tatum, why don't I start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Rothstein on that question of what's the role of the individual today?
Sure. Well, I think that, thank you for the question. And I want to talk about a very concrete example, which I live in Atlanta. And I want to piggyback on something that Shaw Cashin said, in terms of these neighborhoods, these iconic Black poor neighborhoods that were created by segregation. And certainly you can see that in Atlanta. And what we can each do depends on where we are and what our spheres of influence is. But I want to talk about that example because I serve on a board of an organization called the West Side Future Fund. The focus of the West Side Future Fund is to revitalize 4 historic African-American neighborhoods of the kind that were just described. The average family income is less than $30,000, more like $20,000. A lot of blight, this was a community in which Dr. King once lived, actually, back in the 60s, his adult home with his wife, Coretta, and their children. At that time, it was a community of about 50,000 people in a city that was still highly segregated. Today, it's a community of about 15,000 people because as more opportunities opened up, Black people with resources moved out to other communities. But what's important about this community is that it sits on the edge of downtown Atlanta. And as people want to move, the millennials, white millennials and others want to move back into cities because they don't want to be, on highways all the time. The risk is gentrification displacing the historic Black residents of these neighborhoods. The neighborhood improves, but now it's an all-white neighborhood and the Black people have been driven out. So the question is, to come to your very specific question, what can individuals do? Well, what individuals are doing is leveraging the resources of their workplaces, the corporate entities, saying we need to make what was wrong right. We need to invest in these communities, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't displace the existing residents and create an environment, a holistic, healthy environment that hopefully will be a mixed income community. And maybe some white people will want to live there too. We don't know. But at the very least, we want it to be healthy for the folks who are there now. And we can do things like create an anti-displacement tax fund. So for those elderly Black residents who own their own homes, and there's about 8% about 8% of them do, as the neighborhoods improve and taxes go up, they might be driven out. Can we engage the white philanthropic community and ordinary people who have resources to share to contribute to an anti-displacement tax fund, which will help preserve the tax rate currently for those elderly residents so that they don't have to choose between paying their taxes and keeping their home. That is in place. We have already implemented that as one example. So there are other things that we can do, but taking action requires doing an analysis of what's happening in my community and where can I intervene.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tatum. Mr. Rothstein, same question. What should an ordinary American do about this problem?
There's a great deal that we can do. We need a new civil rights movement in this country. We need a movement, as John Lewis said, that will engage in good trouble to make it uncomfortable to maintain these segregated patterns that we have. As Dr. Tatum said, the first challenge is that so many Blacks and whites don't have ongoing social relationships with other race people. That coming together to create a civil rights movement that's both biracial and multi-ethnic is a challenge, but it can be done. It can be done. People can attend other race churches. They can find ways of approaching people that they work with who are other race, but whom they don't have social relationships with, and engaging in the beginnings of relationships with them. If we had a civil rights movement that was locally based of citizens, I'm not talking about organizations, I'm talking about local people, citizens who engage with others in civil rights activity in good trouble, perhaps the first thing they should do is insist that their schools teach the history of segregation accurately, history of slavery and Jim Crow and residential segregation, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we have, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been able to do. And the reality is that if people understand the history, they'll understand, I think, the obligation to do something about it. If they believe it happened by accident, they to think it can unhappen by accident. So we should have campaigns in local communities to get school districts to stop lying about the history of slavery and Jim Crow. I've looked at the textbooks commonly used in American history courses across the country. All of them lie about this history. None of them mention the kinds of things I talked about before, which are well known and were well known in the past to Americans. I'm going to put in the chat room actually some curriculum resources that people can, yeah, there, I've done it, that citizens can do if they're organized in direct action groups to take actions in their local school districts. So that's one thing to begin to, and of course, if you start to get a conversation in schools taking place in a different and more accurate way, that conversation is going to leak out into the broader community as well. Another thing that a local civil rights group could do is it could address the local institutions that contributed to the segregation of that community. There's the banks, the real estate agencies, the developers, either they or their successors are still in existence today. Those groups that contributed to the segregation of those communities should be contributing, as was just said, to funds that subsidize the home ownership of African Americans, some in existing Black neighborhoods, some in communities from which African Americans have historically been excluded and that would have been affordable to them when they were created, but are now unaffordable. So local institutions, banks, real estate agents, developers who contributed to the segregation should be subsidizing its undoing.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is why it's so powerful for people to read your work, read Dr. Tatum's work. If we don't know the history of who's contributed to this, then it's hard for us to take action now. And so I think that's an incredibly powerful statement. The reason I'm wanting to harp on this a little bit of this notion of what the individual can do is because we're in a moment now where a lot of people have said, as a result of George Floyd and the protests that are happening, this time is different. And I want to stand up and I want to do something as an ordinary citizen. And the question for them then becomes, well, what do I do? And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure we lay out for people exactly what the concrete things are for them to be able to do in order to push this conversation forward. Tiffany, I'm going to come to you and I want to stick on this sort of same theme of like, what can individuals do? Let's say, for example, you're in New York City and you're a student who comes from a privileged background. You go to one of the specialized high schools that's highly segregated in New York City. What should you do? Should you not go to that school? Should you protest in other ways? What's the role of an individual student who wants to be part of a solution here? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I want to highlight something that Stella said earlier, that students shouldn't have to be superheroes because they're minorities. I think that what's very harmful is when people view this idea of like fighting for equity and fighting for equality as our job, as this people who are experiencing these inequities as a result of their own privilege, that it's our duty to fight for us. And it is, but it's not just our job, because these people, and especially the students who are in this position of privilege, are the reason why we have to fight this fight in the first place. And so I think Teens Take Charge was my first, in all 4 or 5 of the schools that I've attended throughout my life, Teens Take Charge was the space where I experienced the most diversity. I hadn't ever seen students from so many different backgrounds. Like I hadn't had so many conversations with another white student than I have in Teens Take Charge. And that kind of showed to me that like, it's not our responsibility to fight for something that was set up against us. And especially just for people who claim Black Lives Matter, for people that have Black Lives Matter in their bio, who posted a Black square on Instagram. Like it's their responsibility not only to talk the talk, but also to fight the fight. Because at the end of the day, we can't be expected to hold the burden that we're facing every single day and also be the only ones that have to change it.
Thank you for that incredibly powerful answer. I want to stick on this theme, and Dr. Flores, Professor Cashin, I want you to get in specifically, you know, a fear that a lot of people had after the George Floyd protests was that this would all dissipate and people would get distracted again, go back to social media, whatever it is that they were doing before. And I think we've seen a little bit of evidence of, you know, the energy has gone down a little bit. So what is different about this moment, if anything, in relation to this broader issue that we are trying to fight of segregation in our housing and in our schools? Is there anything different? Should we feel hopeful about this particular moment?
I don't know about different. I think so. Right, in this line of work, you learn to expect the worst, and so prepare for the worst, right? What I see different is these corporate forces that are now, whether they're window dressing or not, with their Black squares and whatever. I think we take advantage of that and keep reminding them that they made a commitment to that. I think we need more sectors involved in this other than just education and the civil rights people. The other thing I think we need to do is really understand what it means to be anti-racist and to understand using anti-racist education to dismantle racial inequality. And so, you know, I took this moment, for example, at NYU to propose a plan that said, guess what? We have racism at every level of the university, from where we go and recruit in junior high to the board of trustees. And it is our responsibility to understand how there is privilege and disadvantage at each level. And it is our responsibility to understand that it goes beyond the individual action. These are structural issues, as we all can acknowledge probably here on this panel, but the everyday person does not understand the structural issues built into why we have racial inequality. And I think we all, you know, need, I think the textbook example is very interesting, coming from Texas, where I learned that, you know, Mexicans are bad in a room full of Mexican kids. I mean, you know, it's gotten better, but, you know, we need to understand how to propel better research and better education to our students from the very beginning, but also to our teacher education programs, to our principals, to our professors teaching all kinds of students. So it has to be a full cast, comprehensive educational campaign. And I think the corporate people should pay for it.
Professor Cashin, do you want to get in on this question?
A couple things, answering both the most recent question and the one before it about what individuals can do. I do think this time is different. Just looking at the number of white people, I mean, I've seen it in my own city of Washington, D.C., putting up the signs, Black Lives Matter. And, you know, but what I'll say is, even before George Floyd's execution, if I can use that word, there was a word I was hearing a lot with nonprofits and local governments, and it was equity. And there were there's been a groundswell of efforts at the local level to force governments to conduct an equity analysis and really understand in hardcore, concrete terms where they're investing money and trying to reallocate them. And after George Floyd was assassinated, you've seen, you know, there's the whole defund movement, right? You have seen some cities moving fast on some policies, right? Reallocating some resources from policing. There's debates going on in every major town in this country about where resources should be going. That is new and real and important. I think for individuals, obviously you should register to vote and be involved in electing people who believe in equity and who believe in inclusion, who believe Black Lives Matter and are willing to fight for a different allocation of resources. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? I do think we're in a bit of a civil rights movement, and I would say find the organization on the ground that already has a multiracial coalition that's fighting on whatever your priority issue is, whether it's decarceration or defunding or school integration. Particularly in the faith community, there are a lot of organizations that are out there doing that work. And I'd say just join up and get, bring your voice to it.
Great, thank you for that. I want to, and this will actually be for the whole panel. I want to ask the question, a lot of us have put out things that people can do, but my question is, we are, and I opened with this, we're 66 years after Brown versus Board. We're decades after the Kerner Commission. So all of these things that we could do, why haven't they happened? Why are we still living with this issue? So that's the question I want to ask. And maybe I'll start back up at the top. Dr. Tatum, do you have thoughts on this in particular?
Yes. So I want to come back to where I started, which was that quote, the title of King's book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And what I mean by going back there is that there is an individual choice that each of us can make in the ways that we are just hearing, not only in terms of who we vote for, what organizations we get involved in, what kinds of changes we advocate for in our community, but in any moment, we are choosing something that's going to lead to a more inclusive community or one that is more chaos driven. And we hear in the tweets of our current president, for example, his push toward a past that was exclusionary. We can see the possibility of pushing forward toward a more inclusive future. And that, I think, is a choice that we are constantly making. Is where I'm giving my money today, are the people I'm talking to today, are the letters I'm writing today, are the books I'm reading to educate myself today, helping me think more inclusively, or leading me toward a past. And in that book, where all the blankets, that's mine. Where do we go from here? In that book, Dr. King says, after every period of racial progress, there's a push back against that progress. Carol Anderson wrote a book called White Rage. She describes the same process. Periods of forward movement push back against Black progress. And so we have experienced, I think, in the last 20 years, push back against progress. The election of Barack Obama notwithstanding, push back against progress. And yet today, I think the George Floyd moment that we're talking about is a moment that allows us to mobilize and push ahead again. And that's a choice each of us can make.
Great, same question. Richard, going to come to you, and then Tiffany going to go to you on that same question.
Well, I think the reason that we haven't progressed since the Kerner Commission report, since Brown versus Board of Education is, as I indicated earlier, the civil rights movement faded, went away. Too many, I'm going to quote a mentor of mine he knows who I'm talking about. Too many of the most dedicated, passionate young people, Black and white, decided that the way to make social change is to become lawyers like Thurgood Marshall. And the experience of activism has gone away. And this can't be done with think tanks, can't be done with litigation. Of course, litigation is going to be necessary to defend progress that we made, but we can't initiate it with litigation for which there's no public support. the spirit of activism that motivated the civil rights movement of the 1960s somehow has to return. I am very, very encouraged, as I think everybody else is, by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They were biracial, multi-ethnic. That's essential. African Americans don't have the political power to accomplish this on their own, but whites can't lead and tell African Americans how they should live. So it has to be a biracial movement. And it has to be something that people do as citizens, not as PhDs, not as lawyers. Of course, they all have roles to play, but we know what the policies to redress segregation are. It's the political mobilization.
Great. Well, Richard, I work at a think tank, but I'm not going to take that personally, which you said.
Feel free.
Tiffany, hop in on this same question, please.
Yeah, I wanted to address two things. The first thing being just how inequitable the school system is in New York City. Like, we operate under a system of open choice, when in reality we have admission screens that make that not true, especially for students of color. And specifically in District 2, we have people like Maud Marin, who's on the District 2 Community Education Council, spreading harmful ideas about communities of color and aiding in the participation of the school to prison pipeline and the disproportionate policing in schools that are majority students of color, and also spreading this idea that even if a parent's views are racist, they need to be listened to and they need to be heard and taken as a valid concern. When in reality, that's the reason that we're still in this situation in the first place. And when you think about George Floyd and all of these victims of police brutality, all of these victims have gone to segregated schools, and all of these police officers have also gone to segregated schools. So when you really put that into context, it has to be a byproduct of segregation that persists, that we keep allowing to persist year after year. And another thing is, how come we only started talking about students in temporary housing and students that don't have access to Wi-Fi after the pandemic happened? Because the Department of Education was completely fine with that happening when they knew it was happening, when, sorry, they were completely fine with that happening before the pandemic started. Over 300,000 iPads were distributed, and students are expected to type essays and complete all of their coursework on these iPads. That isn't necessarily the best way to do so. And yet they're still expected to go on their day-to-day lives without addressing mental health, without addressing a lot of the issues that come with being a first generation or low-income student in New York City. And they're just expected to go about their day-to-day lives. And I guess my final point will be that when we start to believe, when the Department of Education starts to believe, when Maud Marin and her supporters start to believe in the humanity of students of color, then we'll be able to progress. But as of right now, it's not really looking that way.
You just brought up a number of really great points in a very short span there, Tiffany. There's a lot to get to. Thank you for that. Let me actually, so I want to make sure, I promised that I'd get some audience Q&A questions. And so I have one from the audience that I'd actually like to ask you, Professor Cashin, and that is an audience member who participated in the last panel said the last panel was a lot about the importance of broad multiracial power and Black leadership. And they want to know, it's a two-part question, Professor Cashin, how much power will it take to change the kind of structures we're talking about? And part two of that question is, who is benefiting from segregation as it stands right now, and what's at stake for those people who are benefiting from the system?
Two great questions. Well, depending on what the specific issue is, taking Tiffany's experience, Bill de Blasio has a lot of power to influence school integration just with mayoral powers, right? And so it takes only 51% to vote into office the person who's going to support the policies you want, right? So how, Black people are not 51% in many places anymore. They're not 51% in DC anymore, right? The reality is, in most situations, whether you're advocating for Black or brown or Asian or, struggling whites, you need a multiracial coalition. But all you need to, now with the Electoral College, you might need to be 56, 57, 58%, right? But the beauty of the math is that with each new generation, right? Each new generation is more diverse than the one before it. Younger people are better than their grandparents in terms of their openness to diversity and their empathy, at least in theory, for people who are different. And I don't say this with joy, but as older whites and their generation dies off, older whites grew up in this country, as Dr. Tatum pointed out, expecting to be dominant, expecting to be overwhelmingly dominant, right? So we are going to reach a tipping point, particularly with the sleeping giant of American politics, when Latinx people, young people, most Latinx people in this country are citizens, when they begin to register to vote and vote in numbers equal to what whites and blacks do, you know, it's going to be easier to get to a multiracial coalition that commands a solid majority, right? But you don't have to wait for that to happen. On the ground where you are, you can gather that power, you know, tap the people you think should be running for office, you know, get together behind them, right? So that's multiracial power. It's also Black power, you know, if your coalition sees Black people in a humanized way. The second point, which is, you know, gets to Tiffany's point and the question about why 66 years after Kerner or whatever the number of years we're still segregated. A lot of people benefit from being from segregation. They benefit in a parochial narrow sense, right? If you're in affluent white space, overwhelmingly white, poverty-free space, things are pretty good for you, right? You get the best of everything except for traffic, right? You get more amenities. This country spends about $23 billion a year more in majority white affluent schools than they do in high poverty Black and brown schools. So in a parochial sense, it works for you. You get great teachers, lower teacher student ratios, you know, more AP classes, all of that, right? And affluent people in affluent space, opportunity hoards and doesn't share. They like this system just the way it is, and they are not going to volunteer to dismantle it. Power concedes nothing without a demand. You need that multiracial coalition that gets in there to actively try to dismantle.
Well, it's almost as if you're advertising for our next panel here, which is who benefits from this system. So that was a tremendously powerful answer. Look, panel, this has been fantastic. We're at time. I have a challenge for you, and the challenge is this. I'm going to ask you one last question, but you get to answer it in only 2 sentences. All right, and the first sentence is either going to be yes or no. So here's the question, just to give you a second to think about it. Are you hopeful for the future? Do you think that we will live in an integrated and inclusive in communities and schools in our lifetime? So the question is, are you hopeful for the future on this issue? So yes or no, and then give me a 1-sentence reason why you either are or you are not hopeful. See who can follow the rules here. All right, you got 30 seconds of think time. Dr. Flores, get ready. I'm going to start with you. Are you hopeful, yes or no, and then why? And then I'll lead us around the circle from there and then close us out. Dr. Flores, hopeful, yes or no, and why?
Yes. Because if we don't diversify and integrate, we're going to economically disintegrate.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. Rhyming wasn't a condition, but you managed to do it. That was really great. Let's go to Dr. Tatum. Yes or no, hopeful, why or why not?
Yes, because injustice prevails when hopelessness persists. That is a quote from Bryan Stevenson. And hope is a discipline. So I am required to be hopeful. Otherwise, I wouldn't get up in the morning. Change is possible. We all have to be working toward it. And hope is necessary.
Beautiful. Thank you. Richard, hopeful, yes or no, why or why not?
Well, Stefan, it depends on whose lifetime you're talking about. I'm hopeful that we'll have an integrated society in your lifetime. I don't have such expectations for mine, but I think that because we have such a broader understanding today, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had in American history. Out of that, I think a new civil rights movement can emerge that can accomplish much more than we've accomplished in the past. So I'm hopeful, not confident, but hopeful.
Great. Tiffany, you got the longest lifetime of all of us ahead of you. Yes or no, why or why not?
It's a little loud in my background. Do you guys hear me well?
Yes, proceed. You're good.
I was going to say I'm hopeful because I believe in the humanity of my Black and brown peers, and to lose hope is to stop living.
Thank you. And then looks like you got the last word, Professor Cashin. Hopeful, yes or no, why or why not?
I'm hopeful because hope is a choice. But also, as I said before, the demographics are in our favor. And we're in this moment where people are waking up. I think the majority of people today reject this mean-spirited, awful politics of division and want something better, saner, and more humane. So we just have to keep fighting.
Thank you so much. And with that, thank you to all of our panelists. What a wonderful discussion. Such a beautiful diversity of opinions, multi-generational, multiracial. I think it's a model for the type of coalition needed to move this issue forward in the future. So if we were in a room, you'd all be getting a standing ovation and large applause, but we're all in our own living room. So we'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to turn it over to one of the organizers of this event, Yolanda. Yolanda Melville, we're going to turn it over to you to let us know some logistics. Thank you all very much for participating.
Sure. Thank you again, everyone. It was a fascinating and very informative panel. Stefan, do not leave yet because I think you have to tee us up for the next set of panels coming up tomorrow. But I'm here to invite everyone to our evening award ceremony. So please join us from 6:15 p.m. to 7:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the Summit for Civil Rights Welcome Reception and Award Ceremony. We will honor Elizabeth Powell, Councilwoman Davita Russell, and Attorney General Keith Ellison. Our honorees will receive the Shirley Chisholm and Jim Clyburn Leadership Awards. The ceremony is co-hosted by myself and Carmen Blakely, aka DJ Carmen Spindiego. Access to this event is just a little bit different than we've had in the past panels. Please watch the award ceremony through our YouTube link, which you should have been provided in your programming. We will see you very shortly. Again, thank you to our panel. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to everyone watching. Stefan, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. All right, last thing I'm going to say, I promise, and then folks can get out of here. So tomorrow there are 3 fantastic discussions. This has really been a power-packed set of individuals here at the summit. So tomorrow, the first panel is called Who's Profiting? That will begin at 10. The featured speaker there is Kianga Yamada Taylor. Next at 12:15, the second panel is America Ready for a Second Reconstruction, a Third Founding? The featured speakers there are Eric Foner and Barbara Ransby. And then finally at 2 o'clock, the last session before the closing remarks is What is to be done? How can we help? Featured speaker there is Richard Trumpka. So again, fascinating, power-packed panel of folks tomorrow. That's all we have. We'll close it out here. One more thanks to our panel, and we hope to see you